Greetings and peace, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I would like to begin this talk with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Most Merciful. Tonight, in our continued parts and expansions of our series of educational dialogues and much needed enlightenment that we're getting from Brother Douglas Dietrich, tonight we're on part 5. Part 1 focused on his background, the occult military complex in World War II. Part 2s and 3s collectively were on H.P. Lovecraft and Islam. Part 4 was on satanic ritual abuse, and now part 5 tonight is going to be on the satanic culture of the U.S. of the U.S. as a whole, and how it's interwoven into his experience at the Presidio military base. And Brother Douglas is a benevolent soul who's here doing God's work, and he's always blessed, he's always protected, and on the day of judgment, his enemies shall be destroyed, because he is someone that has served his mother, and she is a benevolent soul, and may God rest her soul in peace. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said that the one who serves his mother, heaven lies at the feet of your mother, and one who serves his mother in this life, there's no enemy or agent of chaos that can stop you from fulfilling your work that is divinely decreed by the Creator. And Brother Douglas is also a published author of Vampirology, which is the great source of vampiric information, and from the true source itself, and basically takes care of the myths that you see from the video games and the movies. So please get Vampirology in ebook and paperback format. And also, please, I would advise you to get the Roswell Deception and the Demystification of World War II. To basically shut down these narratives of what we're going to discuss tonight. So please get both of these books, support our brother, and our brother is protected by my prayers, by the blessings of his mother, whose spiritual presence is always with him because he served his mother. And as heaven lies at the feet of your mother, so too it will always be with Brother Douglas Dietrich's life. So without further ado, Assalamu alaikum, my brother. Peace be with you and yours.
Oh, God bless you. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. You're so kind, and your grace is appreciated. I'll do my best to be worthy. And of course, as people should know, just to date today's episode, we are in the middle of what's known as Thanksgiving Day weekend, and Black Friday was yesterday. But we're definitely, shall I say, I'm just still decompressing. Was brought home early by my beloved son, got some sleep, got up, got some calories into me, and now we're here with Salman Sheikh. A shout out to all of my friends who have been trying to reach me through the weekend, and I understand some of them have been through some through some tribulations, so hopefully we'll be able to speak to them about that tomorrow night, where Salman will also join us, and he joins us on every Sunday. I have to think about it. Sunday and Wednesday, when I transmit myself live, and that's about at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That he joins us. So do join us on the Douglas Dietrich channel on YouTube. All you really need to do is look up Douglas Dietrich on YouTube and you'll find it, with Salman Sheikh, of course. What's the best way people can find your channel, Salman, that you found, the fastest way they can access it on YouTube?
Oh, of course. For Brother Douglas Dietrich's channel, I'm going to post the links in the description below, and I'll also post the links where you can support him via PayPal, and also purchase his books and support this fight against the agents of chaos. And my channel, you just put my first and last name, Salman Sheikh, and I'll pop up. And with Brother Douglas Dietrich, you do the same. But I will link everything in the description below.
Bless you. That's wonderful. So what we're going to do is have Salman Sheikh kind of guide me, and I'll get into it, so to speak, with as we progress. As I talk, more oxygen will enter my brain, and I can become hopefully a bit more coherent. For those of you who are unfamiliar with my biorhythms, I tend to sleep throughout the day, and I'm awake throughout the night. So this is the middle of my biological night, but then again, my biorhythms are always a bit off anyway. There's always a bit of diurnal dysrhythmia going on there. But my beloved Salman will help us through. And so we were talking about the satanic culture in America, and what we did last time was we went through what I believe was 4 hours, if I'm not mistaken. Was it not? And at that period of time, we were talking about satanic ritual abuse, the pervasiveness of it, and how much of that has been covered up successfully by the military-industrial complex. First of all, there's a lot of programming through language. As a matter of fact, I was on transmission just the other night with our other beloved friend, Sammy Romero, and a shout out to he and his dear twin brother, Isaac Romero. And Sammy was, of course, talking about the fact that words really do cast spells, and he had some experiences himself where that worked out for him, and he understands the power of words. And the kind of words that people are programmed by when you're, let's just put it this way. Shout out to Clarice Claudette if she listens to this. She's someone who felt that I could be helpful towards her because of linguistics. Of course, I'm nowhere near the linguist that my mother was. I do my best, but do not have that capacity that she did. But when it comes to linguistics, think of linguistics as the true matrix that we interact with the world in. This is important because this had a lot to do with the Presidio military base, with one of the many projects that I became involved with as a Department of Defense research librarian. And for those of you who don't know, who are listening for the first time, I was a Department of Defense research librarian at the Presidio military base of San Francisco. I entered into that position or was basically groomed for it without my knowing to a great extent by Michael Aquino, who made certain that there was a number of arrangements that ensured I would ultimately become someone who was assigned to liaison task, which meant that Michael Aquino himself became my responsibility, and in a sense I became his. So this is a very negative way to learn about the power politics of the world. But he was a consummate Machiavellian manipulator, and he was someone who treated the world as a game board, and everyone was a playing piece upon it. There's a bit more to his psychology or psychosis that we can go into as we get into the arc of narrative of this particular transmission. But in essence, that's a good place to start. And when I was ultimately involved in my responsibilities with him, that's when I was exposed to the enormous amount of crimes that were committed, facilitated via the American military-industrial complex, and the disillusionment followed that led to my becoming a public informant. This led, of course, to my hemorrhaging much of the atrocities that were ongoing at the Presidio military base in particular, a very important base. Most people are completely unaware of the importance that it held. And ultimately, enough was exposed where they had to shut this base down, which was the equivalent of losing an enormous part of their complex as it stood. This was I had if people were to compare the damage, I had the damage equivalent in terms of what I ultimately was able to accomplish of a nuclear strike. Now, when it comes to the linguistics, however, the linguistics are important because we swim in a matrix of paradigmatic thought and axioms, and our processes, the way we process our reality is through language. We speak to ourselves in our own mind. So if we use the parallel that was used at the time that the military started to work on a particular project concerning linguistics, when we use the parallel of a fish in water, the fish has no real concept that it's in water. It's simply within its aqueous medium where it thrives. And the moment that it's removed from water is when it becomes aware of its dependence on that medium. So it's the same with ourselves when we find ourselves in a foreign environment where everyone is using a different language that we cannot access. At that time, you are literally a fish out of water, or metaphorically, excuse me. You're metaphorically a fish out of water. You begin to appreciate just how much language constructs your reality. Without the linguistic matrix of comprehension, of the ability to speak to other people in such a manner that they understand what you're saying, that you're all exchanging information that is useful in the most immediate sense. Without that, you begin to feel, well, helpless, quite helpless, and theoretically, like the fish out of water, you could die. That's how important language is. So without our ability to interact with others in a linguistic matrix, we're lost, we're helpless. And for that reason, this is why words are so important. One of the words the military-industrial complex exploits in order to deprive you of information is the concept of satanic panic. You'll hear the term satanic panic these days, and it's thrown around a lot, and it implies that there was much ado about nothing, that people were running around, scrambling, chasing thought forms, tulpas, demons in their mind. And this is exactly what the military has wanted you to think. Now, you notice I bring up the military a lot here, and this is because it's a profound source of this kind of satanic infestation, the infiltration, the subversion of American culture. And there's several aspects that we need to go into here. First thing that we need to do is disambiguate this from several different fields of thought. We speak of language, and within language, of course, or rather outside of language and going from there to social engineering, we have several different types of subcultures. And the different types of subcultures that America has manifested, when one thinks of Satanism, one thinks of two separate cultures that come to mind. First off, if one goes back to the 80s and the 90s, when all of my hemorrhaging of information of what was going on in the military became exposed to the American public, at that time, then the thought was people would identify people who were tripping off Satanism, or the people who were Satan hunters, so to speak, are satanic ritual abuse therapists, etc. People would identify them with evangelical Christians. So you would have this evangelical Christian matrix of reactionaries who are essentially half fanatic, half profiteer, who are going around conducting basically faux exorcisms and the like. And then you come to the modern day concept of satanic ritual abuse. And what it's mutated and morphed into, thanks to the work of Michael Aquino, who, by the way, just so people understand this, I habituated myself into pronouncing his name in a manner he disliked. It's a mispronunciation by his own standards. He infinitely preferred Aquino. And at the time that I was liaising with him under orders, as part of my professional responsibility and my assignment, I would use that name. It was, however, something most Americans could not pronounce. Most Americans, even though they could pronounce it theoretically, were too lazy to pronounce it, and did not honor or respect him in the sense, well, let's just put it this way, in a kind of innocent ignorance. Most Americans in the military simply said Aquino, something that he had constant frustration with. The reason this is important is, again, we go back to language. The pronunciation of the Q meant everything to him. And so whenever he would have a kind of secret alias or a kind of name that he hid behind, oftentimes when it came to the simplest of coding, he would use the Q. This is the source of the QAnon, and it started with Michael Aquino. This is what brings us to the next phase of quote-unquote Satan hunters or satanic panic, quote-unquote. Here now what we have is the PSYOP, the psychological operation, that was launched by Michael Aquino so that everyone in America would turn from the Christian evangelical interpretation of the satanic phenomenon and turn instead towards a kind of new perversion that would interpret it for them. And what Michael Aquino did was he subverted the power element of society. So the power element of society has been the white American majority that, of course, is quote-unquote conservative. Here's where language is important. The very term conservative it means to conserve. Now, think of ecological conservation. If we want to take a look at conservative in its most positive connotation, you would think of conservation in the environmental sense. Let's conserve. Let's conserve energy. Let's conserve our resources. So the term conservative has an intrinsically positive connotation in its classical definition. And it means, of course, that you value what is. So a conservative in the Asian sense would be most certainly myself, meaning someone who wants to maintain tradition, someone who wants to maintain a respect for Confucianism, which is the state religion of my birthplace, Taiwan. So let's disambiguate, for instance, the idea of what conservatism is for your average amateur when it comes to thought process. Your average American doesn't know how to think. Now, just to put this into some context here, so that people don't take that as just a empty insult, like there's meaning behind what I say. If you go to either China or Japan or Russia, the one thing that cannot be denied is that these are cultures of thought, and as are many other cultures, of course. But when it comes to the Chinese and the Japanese that I'm most familiar with, they will insist on raising their children to learn in Japan, they call it the soroban, and in China, it would be the abacus. So people who are familiar with this will know that there are little machines that have all of these beads on them, and they slide the beads up these columns, and this is what people would interpret as primitive calculators. These are calculators before the age of calculation. What people may not notice, Westerners, is that the Chinese and Japanese abaci, these calculating machines, they're very different. They're not built the same way. The Japanese ones will have a single bead. The Chinese will have two in a upper separation from the rest of the bead columns. So by that I mean that they're just built differently, okay? Without going too much into the framework of these beads, because honestly, without being able to see them, what I'm going to say is it's just too difficult to describe, honestly. It's beyond my ability right now, okay? So the two different machines, they're built differently. And so what this means is that the Japanese and the Chinese have fundamentally different calculating processes. But in either case, their children are raised to use these. And what it does do is it promotes a kind of mathematical thought process, which leads to what I would call numeracy. Numeracy is numeric literacy. So the majority of us are innumerate, meaning we're numerically illiterate, because most of us do not calculate in our minds. We go straight to the computer or the calculator. So this eliminates a discipline of the mind, and therefore the mind has lost an entire processing capability in the average Westerner. If you go to Russia, they're one of the few places that, last time I checked, things may have changed, but I really doubt it. The Russians still produce slide rules. Now, in America, you would be hard-pressed to find a slide rule. I'm willing to bet there's probably some company somewhere in America, some little company that produces slide rules. But slide rules used to be the Western version of the Abacus or the Soroban. These would be basically the way that Westerners would calculate before there were calculators. So there were ancient science fiction novels. By that I mean ones produced in the 50s, 40s, 50s, when science fiction really got started. And these science fiction novels would say things like, there was one sentence that I will never forget that was talking about men in the future where the engineers are the heroes, man is expanding into space. And they were talking about these future technicians, these techie type heroes as they were viewed back then. And the way they described them was, and they wore their slide rules like swords. And this would show the pride that they took in their ability to whip that tool out and calculate it. That was their sword of the mind. That was their intellectual blade, their Occam's razor, with which they cut the universe. So learning how to use a slide rule disciplined the mind, and Russians still are taught that in school, at least the last time I checked, which, you know, is probably still the same way because Russians are very frozen right now. They're not in a state of cultural development at this point in history. They're very stuck in time. So, but what that imbues them with is an ability, a numerate ability, a process of thinking that makes them, they have a thought capability that many Westerners do not have, or certainly Americans. So by that I mean certain parts of their mind are trained. So when it comes to the training of the mind, all of this is important. And when I was talking about linguistics and the training of the mind and whatnot, this helps people process. It brings us back to what's conservative. I had to think there. I had to go around in terms of my thought processes, trace my way back. And when it comes to the conservative nature of things, to disambiguate so people can process this whole political thing better, and why QAnon is what it is. When it comes to disambiguating, say, a true conservative, to use a historic example that Americans are stuck in, people have basically analyzed this sort of thing in sociology, where they've studied political conversations, where they've studied internet communications. And the only, shall we say, analog or political parallel that Americans have is the Third Reich and Adolf Hitler in terms of talking about politics at all. All they can talk about is at some point their enemy is like Hitler, at some point their enemy is a Nazi, at some point their enemy is a fascist, at some point everything is Weimar Germany and we're headed towards the Third Reich. Americans are stuck in this. This is their infantilism. And their infantilism is such where they will say basically turn this into name calling, and none of it has any, shall we say, basis in history or basis in an understanding of what politics or ideologies like fascism even are. We're not going to turn this into a discussion of what they are, but the point that I'm making with that is I'm stuck with that parallel when I try to explain to people the concept of what's conservative. Because your average American will say conservative taken to an ever further right extreme, that you have a concept of arch conservative or reactionary. When you go further and further right in the American mind, they ultimately go to Nazi. They ultimately go to this concept of this is the furthest right. That's the furthest right, and this is a radicalized right. All of this, of course, then, shall we say, confuses the issue, because then you have to ask, oh, what's conservative? Well, to put this into some historical context for you, if we were in Europe in the 1930s and somebody presented themselves as conservative, if they were of Germanic heritage, then a conservative German would be someone who was either trying to bring back the Austro-Hungarian Empire or reinstate the Kaiser. That would be a conservative. That means that they're trying to hold towards tradition and hold towards what they understood as the basis of Germanic culture. So a person who was a Nazi at that time is not conservative. That's someone who's a radical. So understand that much of Germany was in such a position during Weimar that the population, or a large part of the population, radicalized. So at that point, you're not talking about conservatives anymore. So conservatives have nothing to do with Nazism. So this is why there's this ignorance of we go far right and we reach Nazi. So hopefully I've disambiguated that so people understand that that's not the case. A conservative would be someone in Germany who would be either Protestant or Catholic, identifying with the Second Reich of the Kaiser or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. When it comes to the radicalization and the Nazism, that is a completely different field. And at that point, we're no longer talking left or right. That's radicalized centrism. In other words, if you had a straight line and on the left end would be communism and on the right end would be capitalism, then obviously you're not going to find Nazism on that line except at the center, because that's where you enter a third dimension, get out of that line, and you're talking about a conflation, a convergence of socialism and capital, where you have ultimately National Socialism. And that's the distinguished thing that needs to be said there. So when it comes to America, when we talk about Q and the radical right and the way they project Satanism onto the Democratic Party to that radicalized right of reactionary whites and white supremacists, to them, the Democrats represent liberalism, communism, all of the minorities in America, everyone they ultimately intend to exterminate. And onto these Democrats, they project the Satanism that was emerging out of the Presidio. In other words, all the child trafficking, all of the ritualism, all of this is now projected onto the Democratic elite by the QAnon crowd. And the QAnon crowd has become the norm for the right in America. By that I mean the so-called conservatives. So there are less and less conservatives in America. When you hear that term, it's misused. Many people will call all of these Republicans conservative. They'll think of these reactionary white supremacists as like some kind of arch conservative. Okay, none of that applies. A conservative in America, a true conservative, would be someone like myself who's just trying to hold the system together for as long as they can. That would be conservative. You're trying to preserve what is. So in terms of these radicalized rightists, the right in America, they're not trying to preserve the constitutional republic as we understand it. They're out to destroy it. They're out to destroy it and create an ethno-state. So in that sense, of course, when I use the term conservative in my case, it really doesn't apply either. Actually, I'm quite radicalized myself. For anybody who knows me, and you can find out more about that on my transmissions. We don't need to go into that right now. But the point is, when I say I'm conservative, I'm trying to hold things together. That's, I'm speaking more in a personal sense, like holding my head together right now while I talk. But when it comes to, that's where I'm conservative. But my politics are actually radicalized. But it's not radicalized towards the right. It's radicalized centrist. So in terms of the right, however, they're radicalized in a sense where, well, since I'm radicalized and they're radicalized, and people on the left who are radicalized would be, there's not really many of those in the United States. Understand that that would mean that they would be communists who would be avowing collectivization. And nobody in the United States does that. There are so few that they don't even count. The closest you would get would be Bernie Sanders or that crowd. So all of the politics aside for now, this should help people understand that whereas in the 80s or 90s, when people thought of people speaking of Satanism and the subversion of America by Satanism, people would think evangelical Christians. Now people think QAnon, and the QAnon people on the right all assume that the Satanists are the Democratic Party and liberal progressives. And they think that they all, at the political level, are raping children, eating them, ordering them out of Pizza Huts. And by the way, for those of you who are unaware of what I'm alluding to, there's this entire political scandal involving Comet Ping Pong Pizza, where the QAnon was claiming they were trafficking in children. And this resulted in people literally heading towards Comet Ping Pong Pizza in Washington and trying to shoot it up, etc. This is like the madness that we've descended to in America. So all of the Q is truly satanic. If you want to take a look at the true Satanism in America, this brings us to Q, and that's the satanic enemy, and it's not the Democrats. It's that it's claiming it's themselves, and that's where you will find most of the people trafficking in child pornography. That's where you will find the pedopredators in America, and so this is where we have the reality that we're at today. Hopefully that puts that into some basic groundwork perspective. So with that as basic groundwork perspective, we can kind of go into the horror of where we're heading and the horrors that I had to deal with in so many ways at the Presidio, and how all of this we can take it from there. The one thing I can say is that I am reluctant to go into some areas because, of course, I'll be talking about them on my transmission, and but this would be a good place to speak of areas that I don't cover so much in my transmissions. So I'm trying to avoid news analysis. I'm trying to avoid like current events or topics to any great extent, and I'm also trying to avoid talking about exactly too much about Vietnam and the how that impacted America. Because of the, how would I say this? The reality is, when we think, for instance, of Michael Aquino, who I liaised with for years, and Q, which ultimately emerged from his PSYOP, his psychological operations before he died, it's important to understand that he was a Vietnam veteran, and he was somebody who had served in Vietnam, had seen combat. So we're talking about somebody who was very much part of that which impacted America in a incredibly devastating fashion. Let me try and put this into some perspective for Americans. Now that I've used the Third Reich analogy, and that was almost obligatory, we had to, it's like inevitable for any political discussion with Americans. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, taking Americans towards more, shall we say, deeper history, a good political analogy would be the Ming Dynasty of China. And in the Ming Dynasty of China, they sent forth Zheng He. Zheng He was a Muslim eunuch who was the admiral of the treasure fleet of China. Now, I noticed that Salman Sheikh is nodding. You know of Zhang He? Could you tell us what you know about him?
Yes, Brother Douglas. So Admiral Zhang He, or in the anglicized version, they call him Admiral Zhang He, was the first. He was actually a Sufi Islamic warrior. He was a warrior. He was from the eunuch background, and he circumnavigated the entire globe on his ship. From my studies of him, and basically he just doesn't get the credit because obviously because of his background. So he was basically circumnavigating the globe, doing what he was doing as his aspect of his life as a Sufi, as a martial artist, and he left a big impact on not just Chinese history but global history. But like you said, unfortunately, just because of his background, we're not taught about him, and he's not given his due credit.
Bless you. Thank you so much. So what Salman Sheikh has done is give us an excellent, shall we say, microbiography of this individual so that people can have a better appreciation of him. And Admiral Zhang he, of course, did everything that our man Salman Sheikh said. Only Salman doesn't emphasize enough the enormity of his resources. In other words, Admiral Zhang is not just like the European explorers, the European discoverers, when they traveled the globe in what then became known as the Age of Discovery. They were on, like Salman Sheikh said, basically little ships. Admiral Zhang He was an admiral and was commanding, well, he was in command of a fleet. So it wasn't just a ship, it was a fleet of ships. So we're talking about a navy afloat at sea. And these ships were enormous. The European ships of exploration, which were elegant in their own right, were comparatively minuscule. They would be dwarfed. It would be similar to the kind of smaller ships you see today, smaller naval vessels, framed up against an aircraft carrier. That would be the difference in size between the European sailing vessels and the kind of ship, the dragon boats, the dragon ships that Zhang He commanded, which were the aircraft carriers of their day. So you had this enormous fleet of ships of that size that traveled the world and encountered nothing but what they considered to be barbarous savagery and undeveloped wastelands. And they returned home to China to essentially report that the world was barren, both culturally and in terms of resources to offer China. Now, because of that, the Ming Dynasty was confronted with two other major projects. That, combined with the Zhang He treasure fleet circumnavigation of the globe, basically cemented Ming China as the supreme power on earth. So they were dealing with two other crises simultaneously. They were dealing with the fact that they had an enormous construction project going on in terms of infrastructure. Everything that people hear today about the pyramids were built to align with the belt of Orion and all the rest of this crap, it's not that people didn't build megalithic structures in alignment with the skies. Stonehenge would be exemplary of one of those projects, but many of these other projects are essentially basically shoehorned into that kind of category by modern day pseudo-archaeologists who are just trying to sell books. And the way they sell books is to tell people crap like, yeah, the three pyramids at Giza are aligned with the belt of Orion. And then people go, ooh, and that's neat. It's a neat concept. So they all, you know, by the books, and basically, anyhow, just put it this way. I'll put it this way: Graham Hancock and his fingerprints of the gods and all that shit. It's all just crap. Don't waste your money, and please stop reading that crap and stop watching it on the History Channel. But there's a point to be made here. This sort of phenomena does exist in history. The ancients did follow the stars, and you have ancient observatories. Of that, there is no doubt that phenomenon is real, that the ancients knew about the stars. Observatories were built. Ziggurats in Syria would be far more applicable towards that paradigm than the pyramids of Egypt. But, you know, nobody knows about the ziggurats in Iraq or Syria or any of that, so they just go on doing what they're doing. Because the pyramids are accessible and you can go there without being caught in a war zone, then by writing books about that, then everybody benefits who's part of that industry. The Egyptians benefit from the tourism, and Graham Hancock benefits, you know, all the rest of that. So there's kind of a cycle there that feeds into itself. See it in that context, follow the money, and then you'll get what I'm saying. Most observatories are going to be in high, out-of-the-way places where you're going to be you're going to be winded just getting up there, and so, you know, they're out of the way, and so most people aren't going to be seeing them, and tourists don't really go there except for extreme tourism, etc. And so that being said, at that time, Ming China was attempting to basically operate on the paradigm of as above, so below. And were indeed rebuilding their entire capital to reflect the constellae of the stars of the heavens, so that they would have, the emperor would have the mandate of heaven, literally imprinted on the ground. So when he attempted to manifest the mandate of heaven by rebuilding the entire ancient capital in the pattern of the constellae, this was a Great Wall level project. And when he tried to accomplish this, this had to be done with a lot of lumber, because it took a lot of wood to build these structures, buildings, etc., that would be in the pattern of the constellae and create the greatest city in the world that was literally heaven on earth, as in reflecting, literally reflecting Qian, the great heavens above. So he was denuding and deforesting the environment of China and its environs. This meant that he had to basically make war with other states to gain more resources. And this led to Ming China warring with Vietnam in the south, which was heavily forested. So the Chinese invaded Vietnam during the Ming Dynasty, and they waged a war with Vietnam. Vietnam had an advantage the Chinese did not have. And of course, when the Chinese invaded the southern areas of Vietnam, Cochin China, etc., as they called it, this meant they were also invading Thailand. So when they went into the Siamese Indochina region, and the regional armies responded with war elephants, this would be the equivalent of their having heavy armor, whereas the Chinese did not. So this was a battle that was immense. So this was eating up a lot of the resources of Ming China at the time. So the Ming emperor said that with everything going on here, what we're trying to do with our infrastructure at home and what we're trying to do with conquering the South in this war, this conflict, we don't need any contact with the outside world to distract us, and we don't need people to know that there's a world out there, because we need them here at home for this war and for our infrastructure project. And so all of the treasure fleet was burned. So when Zheng He returned home and made his report, they destroyed the treasure fleet so that they could deal with all their internal problems at home and not worry about the outside world, because the report was they didn't need to worry about it. So this is what led to a much more introverted China, that was extremely extroverted in its regional sense, but introverted in the sense that it did not seek to conquer the world. The world was worthless to it. The world had nothing to offer to it outside of its world in the most immediate sense. China was the world. So the equivalent to that for America was the Vietnam War era. Just as Ming China had this triple consummation effort of circumnavigating the globe, the massive infrastructure project to build heaven on earth, literally, the attempts to wage war with powerful forces that were equipped with weapons they did not have, the Chinese themselves did not possess. Think of America during the Vietnam War era, where President Lyndon Baines Johnson had inherited the situation from John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated, and he is waging a war on poverty and launching men to the moon and fighting the Vietnam War all at once. So this was America at its pinnacle, at its apex. This was an America that was not only landing a man on the moon, beating the Russians in space, but also simultaneously fighting a war on poverty and trying to uplift, sincerely under President Lyndon Baines Johnson, sincerely trying to uplift its black population out of poverty, as well as its impoverished whites, with the war on poverty, investing in infrastructure throughout America, education and mega projects at home, while waging an enormous war in Vietnam, where you had over 1 million men in country in Vietnam itself. So these trips to the moon were the equivalent of Zheng He's treasure fleet ships. They created the Saturn rockets, and these Titan rockets, these incredible Titanic Saturn rockets, were so enormous that there is no facility that can house them. So it was the equivalent of the burning of the treasure fleet. When Wernher von Braun designed these rockets for the Americans, he was designing rockets on the old, outmoded thought processes that these rockets needed to be able to take men to planets that were outside of the range of the moon, just other planets in the solar system. So he designed rockets that could theoretically, they would have to put the astronauts into a state of cryogenic suspension or hibernation. And if they were able to do that, then they could put these astronauts to sleep for years at a time, if that were conceivable, which they worked on doing. Once that was made possible, then these rockets could take them theoretically to the other end of this solar system. In other words, just by, for those of you who don't know, by the way, a rocket is incredibly inefficient when it comes to space travel. This is not something you want to use for space travel. Space travel ideally is where you get out of the gravity well of planet Earth with a space station and launch from there. It's where you get onto an area outside of the gravity well, and then whatever spacecraft are designed purely for space. It would be like true space vehicles rather than interfacial vehicles. A rocket is something that you're using all of the energy just to break free of the gravity of Earth. So when it comes to that, that's the most inefficient possible way. But in those primitive days, this is what the Americans were working with, and what Wernher von Braun was happy to gift them was basically, sure, keep them in this primitive stage of spatial development, and that was fine with him. So he developed this super primitive technology that could theoretically, once it got free of the gravity well of Earth, multiple stages, the rocket could discard all of its lower stage rockets and thereafter use smaller rockets that would take you in space. You need much less thrust without the gravity, and you would bounce off of the gravity wells of other planets. You could theoretically use this to get to Pluto, the other end of the solar system, which is so far away for all intents and purposes, that you're traveling almost to another star. So this theoretically would take years, but theoretically you could get astronauts to Pluto using one of these rockets. And they're so large, so enormous, that there's no structure or facility that could house them. So after the space program died, when it ended, when there was no longer an interest at the level that the public was willing to support it to the degree that they had with the landing on the moon, then these enormous structures were left to rust out in the open, and that was the equivalent of the burning of the treasure ship. So hopefully people get more of an idea. So here you have these enormous structures that could take men to the moon, actually did so, could take men to the other side of the solar system, and in the end, America did nothing with them. Another analogy of that, take a look at the space shuttle. We have no more space shuttles, no civilian space shuttles. The person who said, let's start a civilian space trucking program was Richard Nixon. So all of the space shuttles that we used through the 80s, through the 90s, until the last space shuttle died, they were all built under the Richard Nixon administration. So you're talking about, he was the man who helped Vietnamize the war, meaning pulled the Americans out, ended the war in Vietnam officially before the fall of Saigon. So we're talking about from Lyndon Baines Johnson to Richard Nixon. This was the height of America's space program. And when the last shuttle died, when they used it to death, there's no longer any civilian space shuttles, for those of you who don't know. Then once they used that all up, that was it. So America's entire pinnacle of empire, just like the Ming Dynasty China, was that period. It was their equivalent of that. So here they were going out to other worlds, had spatial interfacial capability. By the way, what the space shuttle is what you would call an interfacial craft, meaning that it's a atmosphere and vacuum, hard vacuum craft that could interface with both elements. So again, very inefficient. You really want something that's already in space that would reach there be built on a space station. You'd want to assemble a space station and build ships that are hard vacuum craft, period, on the space station, and they would more efficiently go from place to place because they're not breaking free of gravity wells. These were just for that interface. So it was like, nevertheless, it was revolutionary. It was revolutionary in the sense that it could do that. And so when you had these Saturn V rockets, the space shuttles, all of that, while America was waging a war in Vietnam overseas, with 1 million men in country, and the infrastructure projects at home, the war on poverty, all of this triple investment, there was the height of America's imperial apex. That, of course, is the example of, like Ming Dynasty China. Once that was over, then you had the societal collapse, the change of a dynasty ultimately. For the Ming, with America, that's where we're headed. So that's the context in which to see much of what I'm speaking about. So when I say the war in Vietnam, that means that during that era, what happened was something that was much more monumental than the kind of impact we'll see coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan. But nevertheless, that's going to be incredibly impactful, and it will be the death of this republic, the loss of Iraq and Afghanistan. This is why the Vietnam era, which Aquino served in, was where the last of the old World War II officer class died off. All of the first thing that one would notice if one takes a look at World War II and you see all of the officer class and the high command of the Americans, the first thing any young person looking at them when they see General Douglas MacArthur, General Marshall, and you take a look at all of they're all old, all of the generals in World War II of the American high command, the first thing you notice, General Patton, they're ancient. They're ancient. All of them are old. They're very old. And so people who ascended to an officer class during World War II as younger men would be retiring by the time of Vietnam. Vietnam would be their last war. And then there was the fragging phenomenon, in which many officers were killed by their own troops in Vietnam. That was the most dangerous war for an officer because so many men were killing their officers. Much of the officer class was fragged, died off. All of this resulted in an enormous change in the army and in society at home. And when Michael Aquino came home, then what he brought with him was this kind of change. And it wasn't, he's just a single individual, but he represents the pattern. He represents what had happened. Because as I said, when I was conducting an interview with Penny Bradley, the day after I was interviewed by Salman Sheikh, thank God we're not doing that twice in a row this time. I did that on Halloween, and that almost killed me. But when it comes to one of the points I was making was that in Vietnam, Michael Aquino, along with many other people, was affiliated with Operation Phoenix, where they were killing the communists in South Vietnam, people who they felt were communist spies, agents, saboteurs, subversives. All kinds of innocent civilians were killed in that operation, tens of thousands of them. Those killers came home from Vietnam and became the core of Michael Aquino's army of serial killers that he unleashed on the United States. Satanic serial killers like the Zodiac Killer, many others. I described before how one of the men I had to deal with at the Presidio military base who was entering the library was a U.S. Army Green Beret Master Sergeant. And important to remember, Michael Aquino himself was a U.S. Army Green Beret Special Forces. Only he was an officer. This guy was a non-commissioned officer, an enlisted man who had made it to the rank of sergeant. And this was Michael Ramirez. His nephew was Richard Ramirez, the Satanic Night Stalker. And so there was this entire satanic cabal of serial killers unleashed on America, many of them veterans of the Vietnam conflict, Operation Phoenix, the killing of women, children, civilians in an infrastructure. They came home and did the same thing to Americans. Michael Aquino and these kinds of people brought the war home. And so when the American empire experienced this triple investment, it experienced a kind of multifrontal collapse. And so the effect of Vietnam on America, hopefully people understand now, was apocalyptic. Apocalyptic. It was the death of America. It was the end of the empire. It was that which changed our world. We are still impacted by that war. The war was brought home, and what it did was it militarized all of America. All of America became involved in this narrative that the troops were betrayed in Vietnam, that the government let them down. This is why the radicalized right declared war on the government. And so we're talking about an anti-governmental right-wing radicalization, which Aquino helped to pioneer. And again, we go back to him because he was the man I was liaising with, who had a very uncredited impact on our world, in the sense that Admiral Zhang did. This is in no way, shape, or form to compare the two as personalities, but rather to compare them in impact. Admiral Zhang circumnavigated the globe and was a very positive figure, but it's got to be remembered, he was an admiral. This was a man who was a military man. And Admiral Zhang, when he encountered resistance, when he encountered hostiles, he basically cut loose with military retaliation. So understand that this was not somebody who was going around just presenting flowers to everyone. This was a person who was in charge of a military fleet, and that military fleet responded to hostility with military action. So, too, You have Michael Aquino, a military figure. Only in the case of Admiral Zhang, he was very benevolent in general. Michael Aquino was very evil. What you have is nevertheless people who have far more of an impact on history than people are aware of. Hopefully that makes sense, if people understand what I'm saying. So in the case of Michael Aquino and all the war being brought home, that's the context for a lot of the subversion of America, and with the radicalized right that we have, that's a lot of the context for the horror that we're going to experience now that America has retreated from Iraq, retreated from Afghanistan. These troops are going to come home. And this will be the coup de grace. This will be the killing blow. What Vietnam did to start America on the descent, the literal descent into hell, not metaphorical. By literal, I mean in terms of to the point now where we have people who believe in Q and they literally think Democrats are trading in human children and eating babies. Whereas the people behind the QAnon phenomenon are responsible for that and projecting it onto the Democrats. The Democrats represent people like Salman Sheikh and myself. It doesn't matter. We don't even need to be registered Democrats. I am. I don't know about Salman Sheikh and I don't care. Salman Sheikh is simply stuck by default as a minority American. He's the kind of person who would be target for extermination by the Islamophobic radicalized right. So he's simply stuck by default in the minority status that I am and so many other people are who are basically registered or not. We're essentially stuck into the category by the radicalized right as being that which they hate, that which is not real America to them, that which is not white America, that which is not, they're not even Christian. So what could you call it anymore? It's just, to them, we're simply the enemy. They don't represent Christianity and they don't even claim to on the radicalized right anymore. Their religion now is Q. See, and that means they're Satanists because that's what Q is. That brings us to the satanic subversion of America. So let me try and put that into some context in terms of the military industrial complex, which I brought up in terms of so much that haunts America right now. One of the things that I've brought up before in the past, of course, and I haven't gone into it in a long time. And of course, we have our brother, Jameson Reese, was asking me forever to go into this direction. I might as well go into it now. Now that I've kind of outlined the context of Satanism in America, I could go a little bit further. I've brought up in the past the Jewish American conspiracy analyst, May Madden Brussel. And May Madden Brussel was ultimately assassinated. But without a doubt, she stands out as one of the premier researchers and investigative journalists in history, although few even knew her name. And so she can be accurately described as one of the forerunners of what is now accepted commonly as citizen journalism in the current blogging world. And May Madden Brussel directly inspired the works of prominent researchers into quote-unquote alternative information. I hate that name. It reminds me too much of alternative facts that people use in the radicalized right. The same people who say that conventional media is all fake news, which of course, you know, there's always a degree of that, but it's taken to a pathological extreme by the radicalized right. But May Russell was a true research virtuoso who exposed many events of suppressed history. She was the daughter of a rabbi and the granddaughter of I. Magnin, of the I. Magnin clothing store empire, a married housewife with 5 children when JFK was assassinated on November 22nd back in 1963. The year my late sister, was born. Now, that assassination became the catalyst of May's relentless quest of research and exposing suppressed truths. And she began her journey by purchasing the entire 26-volume set of Warren Commission documents, which of course was a complete fabrication covering up facts, murder, and other criminality. And so what had happened was that on December 16th of 1970, May's daughter, Bonnie Brussel, was killed in an automobile accident, which May understood was a warning to herself. Her daughter was killed by a U.S. Army soldier in full uniform on duty who was not even arrested on site. He walked away. The police just let him go. And no one was ever charged. So that's your military-industrial complex right there. And other threats were launched towards her when she exposed links between elements of the United States military to satanic cults and practices. And all the death threats that followed eventually forced her off the air. She was basically kind of like what Art Bell later became. And you know Art Bell was full of shit because nobody ever threatened him in the way they threatened May Magnin Brussels, because he wasn't exposing anything. So you can always tell the phonies. They're lacking in gang stalkers, and they're not suppressed. They're given full airtime and sponsored. Now, she had her own little show, like I said, like my digital transmissions that I host, like what Salman Sheikh does. Only hers was the ham radio version of that back in the day, before they had all this digital shit. And she was forced to stop that, but she continued producing broadcasts from her home and privately mailed them to subscribers. That was how she handled that. And her work was later featured in the publication called The Realist, which was secretly financed by John Lennon, which was why, according to his Japanese wife, Yoko Ono, he was assassinated. Hopefully the pattern begins to set in here so that people see the reality of it. Now, John Lennon's own son believes his father was assassinated for that very reason, his sponsorship of May Magnin Brussels. And of course, people just dismiss him by saying, he was raised by Yoko Ono. Or, of course, he's crazy. That kind of shit. You know, the typical American mentality. He's a half-breed. He's not white. You can't trust him or believe anything he said. I bet most of you don't even know John Lennon and Yoko Ono had a fucking son because he's half Japanese. So you never heard of him. Again, suppressed information right there. But May Magnin Brussels went back to regular broadcasts in 1983 at Kazu, K-A-Z-U, in Pacific Grove, California. And those concluded on June 13th of 1988. By the way, Kazu is short for my Japanese name, Kazube. If anybody's ever seen the characters which comprise my Chinese name, Yiping, it's the same characters. In the Japanese, they're read as Kazube, as opposed to in the Chinese, they're read Yiping, but it's the same characters. And they mean the same thing in either language. But when it comes to the diminutive, then people would call myself Kazu. They would say that as opposed to Kazi, which would mean fire, as in someone burning up or burning out. So that is not a diminutive people would say in Japan because it would be impolite and have a negative connotation. So Kazu would be my diminutive. That was why those initials were chosen by May Magnin Brussels. I had talked her out of suicide because she was being tormented by visions of her daughter, who would appear and tell her that she couldn't go to heaven until her mother accompanied her by killing herself as well. I explained the occult dynamics behind what she was experiencing, which was the fact that she had elements of her daughter's automobile, the car in which her daughter died, on her property to provide her with a bond to her daughter. This is what Michael Aquino took advantage of. This is something that I've explained before as artilica technology or occult technology. This is something that a conventional engineer would not understand. It would take an engineer who's educated in alchemy and the occult to work with such technology. So the occult technology is very important. We'll get this out of the way. And it's kind of a segue to what we'll get into. But when it comes to the artilica technology, understand that in 1970, December of 1970, May Madden Brussels' daughter, Bonnie, was killed at the age of 15 in a highly suspicious automobile accident. Her other daughter survived, who was driving the car, but was diagnosed to be paralyzed for life. Barbara Brussel. She was driving the car and she was literally probably around 17, 18 years of age. You know, in America, you can drive between the ages of 16 and 18, so long as your parents give you permission and you have a special permit license for that. That's the way it used to operate back then. I don't know if they've changed the laws, haven't kept track of it. I don't drive myself. But her daughter, both daughters were very young. They were in the car together. One was driving. They were hit by a soldier in the United States Army who was stationed at Fort Ord in California, who, after the crash, he went AWOL, absent without leave, means deserted his post, deserted his station. He returned to his home, was never sought by any authorities, military or civilian, which means he had to be operating under orders. He had to be doing this under military control. It's like what I express about the individual who was the hero of Black Hawk Down. The sergeant in the movie is named Danny Grimes. He's played by some Scottish heartthrob. The real historical individual who's portrayed in the film Black Hawk Down was a sergeant named Stubby Stebbins, John Stebbins. And Sergeant Stebbins ultimately was basically raping children, as so many of these military men were involved with. And when it came to this child rapist, his wife turned him in because she got tired of hearing all the screams from the children he locked up in the basement. And these are the kind of people behind Q, just so people understand this. And this individual, because he was exposed, was ultimately taken in by the military and confined to the military prison at Fort Leavenworth. Now, understand this. All of the crimes he committed against children that were reported by his wife were because he was retired. You see, when he was overseas, like in Africa, he was raping children overseas. So that's not something that affected his wife. That's not something that affected anyone back home. When he was retired, he had no children to rape other than American children. So when he was sentenced to Fort Leavenworth, this is a man who had retired. And so people will contact me and they'll say, oh, you can't blame this on the Army. He committed all his crimes after he was retired. I point out he's in a military prison now. There's no way he could be in a military prison if he were not under military control. The whole point is that if he was retired and he was raping all these kids, why is he not in a civilian prison like any other civilian? He's in a fucking military prison because he was under military control. There's no other explanation. It's either you're pregnant or you're not. You're not going to wind up in a military prison unless you're in the fucking military. under active control. That's the way it works. They cannot put you in a military prison just because you're a veteran. Or if you're not on active duty, you're not going to be in a military prison. It's that simple. So he was under military control, period. So understand this individual was the same way. The nameless individual who was never sought by the authorities, who killed the daughter of Maid Magnan Brussels, critically injured the other. Barbara Brussels' legs were severely injured, suffered a broken back, facial injuries, broken nose and arm. She ultimately recovered and regained her ability to walk and even dance. But Maid Magnan Brussels was still seeing her dead daughter, Bonnie, the 15-year-old. And now this kind of technology is based on a kind of auric bonding. It deals with the person's ectoplasmic energy. So people who die in extremely traumatic accidents, especially in vehicles, whether it's a stagecoach or whether it's an airplane, when you're on the move and you die quite suddenly, the essence in that traumatic death tends to bond with your vehicular enclosure. And elements of that can be taken and used by a necromancer. So when it came to her daughter Bonnie, who kept telling May Brussels to kill herself, what she perceived to be the ghost of her daughter was in fact a holographic image projected into her home via satellite. But it needed a tether, an anchor, like a receiver, in order for it to work. What it was working off of were the parts of the car Bonnie died in that were in the home of May Magnan Brussels. So a good example of this would be Eastern Airlines, which what happened was Flight 401 crashed in the Florida Everglades. Eastern Airlines was a flight company that was owned by a relation of Martin Bormann, Frank Bormann, who was an astronaut, a U.S. astronaut. And he was despised by the military-industrial complex. They considered him the Nazi enemy in the United States. And so when Flight 401 was taken out by the U.S. military with a bomb on board and crashed in the Florida Everglades, and many people died, probably everyone. Certainly the pilot and his chief flight engineer both died in that crash. And then what happened was, because Michael Aquino's cultists from the military understand that people who work in the military began to infest America's civilian infrastructure. A good example is this kind of pattern where almost all, say for instance, how many people learn how to fly? Most of you will never learn how to fly. Say if you were rich and you wanted to learn how to fly, what are you going to fly? The most you could fly if you were very rich would be a private jet. There are business jets. However, the overwhelming majority of people are not that rich. They're going to fly chicken shit little Piper Club, these Piper Cub type planes with the propellers. So your average person is going to be flying a prop driven plane, and you're going to say, oh, that's great. You're going to be, if you're wealthy enough, you're going to be flying that plane into some isolated home way up in the hills someplace. And there were places in bumfuck California that I have been to that are so isolated, they've got their own landing strip for the private plane. You're going to be in a situation like that, or you're going to be like, you're going to have a plane that sits in kind of like a garage at a flight center that you go to, where you pick it up like you would have a boat on the marina. That's your boat, but it's going to be parked in a public marina. It'd be like that. But none of you are going to be learning how to fly a real jet. except unless you're like multi-billionaire level. So who flies these jets? Where do they get their training? See, the majority of jet pilots are ex-military. So when it comes to the people, what about helicopters? How many people? First off, just so people know this, it's far more difficult to fly a helicopter than it is to fly a plane. A helicopter is incredibly complicated. You can teach monkeys to fly spaceships, and they've done that. You could never teach a monkey to fly a helicopter. A helicopter can do things a bird cannot do. Seriously, a helicopter can hover like an insect. It can fly backwards. You can do things a bird can't do. So a helicopter is an incredibly complicated flying instrument. And who learns how to fly them? When you see people with private helicopters, who's flying those helicopters? There's no one who trains people to fly helicopters on a private level. Every helicopter pilot on Earth is ex-military. So understand there are entire professions where in the civilian world, you have helicopter pilots who fly for weather channels. You have helicopter pilots who fly for the oil industry, in and off oil platforms, and they land on the super tankers. You have all of these people all over the world flying these helicopters. Every single one of the motherfuckers was trained in the military. There's no such thing as a civilian helicopter pilot. At one point or another, they were all trained by a military of some nation. You don't have private helicopter training facilities where people go to helicopter school. So when it comes to many professions like that, all of these guys are ex-military. And of course, many of these people can't be hired anywhere else. You get people who go in the military and all they do is repair tanks. What profession do they have outside other than preparing? Say, for instance, they might be able to repair Caterpillar tractors. That's a company that produces like treaded tractors. But aside from that, your average engineer is completely incapable of transitioning from military to civilian, and yet you have those who repair planes for the military, then they become flight engineers for civilian airlines. So the civilian airlines are loaded with ex-military flight engineers, and these are maintaining the planes on the ground, some of them. And what many of them did was they cannibalized parts from Flight 401 and basically put those parts in other planes in the fleet of Eastern Airlines. And then everyone who was a passenger or a stewardess or a staff flight member, like a pilot or a flight engineer, a navigator, etc., on these planes began to see the ghosts of the pilot and the chief flight engineer of Flight 401 all over Eastern Airlines for over a period of years. And each of those flights had in common the fact that the planes all had parts salvaged from Flight 401. And when these ghosts would show up, they would scare everyone to death, tell them they were all going to die. And finally, it got to the point where the man who owned Eastern Airlines, Frank Borman, the astronaut, the CEO, he threatened to fire any employee who publicly discussed these sightings. But then he finally, when I contacted him and told him to remove all the cannibalized parts, he didn't even know there had been parts cannibalized from Flight 401. When he did the background research into it and found out this was indeed the case and fired all the engineers who had inserted these parts and had those parts removed, those ghostly apparitions were never seen on the airliners again. So you see, all of this requires a tether, an anchor, a receiver for the bonded spirit to be harnessed by the necromancer. This is the Artilica technology which Michael Aquino was working with. When it comes to the linguistic technology, I was bringing up linguistics earlier and language. One of the men that, not necessarily Michael Aquino, but the military was working with, was a man named Dr. Brown, and he was the inspiration for the children's series of educational books, Encyclopedia Brown. And Dr. James Cook Brown was his full name. And Dr. James Cook Brown was a brilliant linguist who was designing an artificial language, what they call a conlang, construct language. And so at that time, Dr. James Cook Brown was a linguist who was brilliant enough to design the popular board game known as Careers. So whether you know it or not, if you're a little bit older, my generation, you would have grown up likely playing that game. Careers was a board game that was as popular for several generations as Monopoly. Matter of fact, it was the second highest selling board game in the world after Monopoly. So if people look up Parker Brothers and they look up the board game Careers, that was designed by James Cook Encyclopedia Brown. And the encyclopedia was a nickname, of course. But James Cook Brown, as a linguist, he was also very much a communist, ideologically a socialist. He wrote a science fiction novel called The Troika Incident, and this earned him the ire of the military even when they hired him for his services. So what had happened was that he was impacted by Aquino in the sense that he was hired by the Department of Defense, contracted, to design a military language that would be the most efficient human language. What they wanted was a language that would get rid of all cultural baggage, that would basically eliminate useless concepts. And so this is how you can reprogram the mind so that it processes at a greater level of efficiency if you eliminate certain linguistic concepts. You don't want a language to be poetic, culturally burdened. If you want it the most basic language, this is why he developed what was called loglan, or logical language. Since he copyrighted loglan, you'll see it on the internet sometimes as Lojban, Lojban, which is loglan in the language of loglan. In other words, it would be like Esperanto, the international language, and you see the name spoken of within the language of Esperanto. To put it into perspective for you, we say Spanish, but a Spanish-speaking person would call their language Español. Does that make sense? You understand what I'm saying? In other words, if you were to use the term German, they wouldn't call it German, the language in Germany. They would call it Deutschensprach, meaning German speak. Japanese in Japan, they wouldn't say Japanese as a language. They would use the term Nihongo. In other words, it's the language's own name for itself. So you'll see it as Lojban on the net because they couldn't use loglan because it was copyrighted by Dr. Brown, who's not dead, by the way. And what happened was that Dr. Brown, when he was contracted by the US military to make this military language, it was so that there would be a specific NATO language. In other words, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization consists of many different language-speaking nations, Germany, France, etc., along with Britain and America. And as a baseline, they tend to speak English. But the idea was to create supranational units. Supranational units would mean many different nations in a single unit, and rather than imposing English upon them, which would seem imperialist and ultimately create resentment, the idea was to create a universal language for them that would be a specific NATO military language, and thus Dr. James Brown was working on Loglan, a logical language which would eliminate cultural baggage and therefore be a perfect military language. And what he did was he took all the major languages in the world at the time, about 8 of them, and combined them into a single language by removing all parts that were excess of what they had in common. So the most spoken languages in the world at the time, in the 1980s, was Japanese, Chinese, Russian, Asian Indian, or Hindi. Then there was English. Yeah, I almost forgot that. French, Italian, German, and either Spanish or Portuguese. Spanish, I believe. I know one thing. The 9th language that almost made it was Arabic, but it was just once they got those 8 top languages, Arabic was the 9th language, and it wasn't incorporated. So these other 8 languages, they combined them all by taking their commonalities, and they got rid of all the baggage and were blending them into a refined language with all the concepts that all of those languages had in common. They created the Loglan, which, by the way, was far more international than either Esperanto or Interlingua, which are 2 famous conlangs or construct languages. Esperanto is the most famous of them all, but if you hear it, you'll just think people are speaking like French or Italian or Spanish or something, because it's very European. These are all very Western-based languages. So at least Loglan went way beyond that to integrate many Asian languages. These days, of course, the most spoken languages in the world would change. It would the populations have exploded in Pakistan and Indonesia, for instance. So you'd have those would be some of the major languages up there, simply by dint of the population numbers that are speaking them. But in terms of that language, Dr. Brown, he was working out of the University of San Diego in California. And what had happened was that in order to apply his language in the field, they had special forces units who were training in his language, and they would turn them loose in the field and see if they could operate using his language. But of course, they had to be communicating with a headquarters or a base of operations that would speak that language. So there was an individual I knew who was a master sergeant in the U.S. Army Rangers, the Black Berets, and he was assigned to go live with Dr. James Brown in his home, in his residence, so that he could operate the communications gear, the radio, with units operating in the field in South America or other places in the world, speaking that language, where the doctor would be on hand to consult, so they could have these units in the field speaking that language under conditions of operation. He ultimately wound up raping Dr. James Brown's children. And when he was caught doing this, he did this over a period of time, what you'd call child molestation, predation. When he was caught doing this by the doctor severed his contract with the Department of Defense. He wound up taking what money he had, and he had quite a bit. He had made a lot from the board game careers. And he built a catamaran, like a trimaran or a catamaran, this very special sailing ship. And he tried to sail around the world using Logland as a universal language for peace. And he ultimately died at sea. That was the tragic end of Dr. James Brown. But what was worse was that when I had dealt with this man because as a Department of Defense research librarian, I was ordered to liaise between him and the U.S. Army Ranger Master Sergeant who was assigned to him when they were conducting these operations, because oftentimes they would triangulate through the Presidio Military Base Library where I was at, so that they would have references outside of their own references to work with in terms of both information references and in terms of a kind of geo-coordinate, a geographic coordinate point. I knew him a bit. I wouldn't say very well, but knew him well enough. Knew everything that had happened. And when I later on investigated at the University of San Diego in California and asked them about Dr. Brown, who had been a major member of their department, was dealing with all of these languages, had gotten them fat budget contracts with the U.S. military. These were as affiliated with the University of San Diego that he was a part of, as well as himself. When these professors and these academics work with the military, it's not just them, but the universities they're involved with that get involved in the Department of Defense contract, just so people understand, because the Department of Defense is like leasing them from the university. So when I went to the University of San Diego, they claimed they never heard of Dr. Brown. Now, obviously, we know he exists. The book is out there, The Troika Incident, written by Dr. Brown. We know the board game Careers is out there. We know that the man existed. Yet, when I went to the very university, which he was a major staff member of, they claimed he didn't exist. That he was completely scrubbed from their records. They had no knowledge of him. This was the linguistics department, which he once headed. This is an example of the importance of linguistics, the importance of the horror of the military-industrial complex, the kind of people that we're dealing with. Now, when you think of all the serial killers that I mentioned, the Zodiac killer being spotted in full military uniform, combat uniform, field uniform, the boot prints he left were military-grade issue boots. You could think he was a fetishist for military surplus, but he operated with military precision in his serial killing and was never discovered, and was, of course, confident enough, arrogant enough, where he was writing the FBI and taunting him to the point where they're only beginning now to decipher the Zodiac killer codes. This is the kind of deep state that the right wing is always talking about. But what's the deep state? It's the fucking military they so worship. All of the radicalized right worships the military. Well, the military is the source of all the vile Satanism that they project onto the Democrats. This is the nightmare Satanism of American culture that we live in. So I've given you these kinds of transitional technologies and techniques, such as artificial languages and Artilica technology, as an example, a transitioning point to where we get into what I was alluding to earlier, something that James and Reese had wanted me to get into for a long time, because I've covered so much about the Presidio military base and so much of my experience there when it came to the children who were subject to so much abuse. We covered satanic ritual abuse in the last transmission with Salman Sheikh, and try and look at it from my perspective for everybody. We'll get into more of that. If Salman Sheikh asks questions, he can guide me back into that direction. But in general, try and sympathize. I'm someone who spends a great deal of his life drinking and partaking in drugs to forget everything I possibly can. These are not pleasant experiences when I recall them. There's something that is traumatic for me. And so when I go back into these experiences, it impacts me for days at a time. Now, the interesting thing is, and I want to at least comfort people with this, should they care, I sleep well. For the longest period of time in the early days, and by that I mean back when I was on Revolution Radio, when I was communicating with the public, I was still suffering what the civilian world would call night terrors because of my complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I would wake up shouting myself hoarse or screaming. This was very shortly after my parents' death, and I had been taking care of them for over a decade. Now, we'll bring this up again on transmission sometime when Peter Moon is with us. Salman Sheikh and I will discuss it with him, but he, of course, is very much into some kind of dream interpretation based on his Scientology training. He comes from that background. And so he's very excited when I brought up one of the dreams I had the other day. And he was like saying, oh, we really need to start getting into your dreams. Now, the interesting thing is what I experienced as a public informant was I had to come clean with everything, because if I didn't, then the military industrial occult intelligence complex would expose it anyway. And they would expose it in a far more negative context and make it as dementedly, pervertedly warped as possible so that people would never understand the context. So I was always open about everything about myself that could possibly be exposed. So one of the things I'll have to explain to Peter is there has to be some limits, and I'm not about to start exposing my dreams other than when it organically or casually comes up and I happen to be willing to relate them. There has to be some level of privacy. But the one thing that I can say or feel comfortable saying is that the overwhelming amount of my dreams at this stage of my life are generally pleasant and not nightmarish. They're mostly spending time with my parents comprises a lot of my dreams or the contents thereof. But in that sense, people have to understand that whenever I speak of these issues like the child molestations at the Presidio, the mass child abuses, etc., that reverberates, that echoes in my dreams. That's something that when it organically comes up or the right questions are asked, then I can discuss it. But it's definitely one of the things that made myself, shall we say, leery when I was talking with Salman Sheikh about today's episodes. One of the reasons that I was kind of leery about it was because the impact that it does have. And that's why, not quite sure if we're going to do this monthly, but Salman gets the point. You know, we're going to go with it as I feel comfortable with it, and we'll see what organically comes out. But the problem is that I can't deliver each and every time the story that many people are interested in, which is the abuse of the children, the trafficking of them, and where that takes us because of just the impact it might have on my mental health. But we'll go there. I mean, we've gone there in the past. We went there into the satanic ritual abuse last time. We'll probably go there again to a degree today, but definitely one of the other things that I'll get out of the way, so to speak, was the technology that Jameson Reese was asking me to speak of for a long time that was very satanic, which was the development of the neutron bomb and what that had to do with the prionization of individuals that the Americans found themselves not experimenting with, but rather subjected to, because they were dealing with forces that they didn't understand. So to start off with the kind of, shall we say, area that I went into a long time ago when I was speaking of the concept of zombies, and when Americans watch these series like The Walking Dead, which has become an American obsession, and this obsession with zombies where they're just in every cultural venue, infecting even the Game of Thrones. Everybody has this concept that's imbued upon them by popular culture. But as I've mentioned before, this really traces back originally to what I was speaking of with James Arthur Yanchik years ago. Of course, with that idiot, he, how would I say, fucked up the narrative so bad by cutting it off into 2 separate episodes that nobody got to part 2 where I was speaking about everything. It's a Tara. So you're talking about an idiot who just, we may as well get into some of this now with Salman Sheikh, because this is a topic that brings us back to today with everything that's going on in geopolitics and is quite relevant. It's very topical. One of the things that's going on is that Israel has essentially aligned itself with the House of Saud and Turkey. So we have this very cynical geopolitical maneuvering, a new alignment forming that is anti-Iran. They're uniting against Iran, and they're uniting against basically Palestine and Lebanon. And so when you have Israel doing this, there was, of course, this movie produced for all intents and purposes in Israel called World War Z. Now understand that World War Z was a novel written by a man who was the son of the great Jewish comedian Mel Brooks. His son's name is Max Brooks. Max Brooks went to Reserve Officer Training School, the Reserve Officer Training Corps, ROTC. ROTC is how they pronounce that acronym. And Max Brooks, therefore, had a level of, shall we say, some military familiarity. And he used that to write the book World War Z. And it starts off with the Sino-Slavic War, the Sino-Soviet War of the 1980s and 90s. That's actually alluded to in the book. There's a reason for this, of course. And there is, of course, the film, which ends on a note that was never in the book. The film essentially focuses entirely on Israel. And in the film World War Z, it ends with the Israelis rationalizing their wall building. They're rationalizing their wall building because, of course, outside of that wall, to them, everyone is a bloodthirsty cannibal zombie, as far as they're concerned. This is how they dehumanize the enemy. Of course, this goes far beyond propaganda. This is where we have to provide an explanation. With James Arthur Yanchik's interview with myself on this subject, what I was bringing up, of course, was the Haitian zombie and the Haitian zombie's connection ultimately towards the Soviet Union and towards the phenomenon of what happened in the Sino-Soviet War that's alluded to at the beginning of the novel World War Z. Now, I once approached Max Brooks and I asked him for his permission if I could have a friend of mine design his novel into a board game of World War Z. And he was open to it, but he said he didn't have the copyright on the novel, so to speak, or rather that people who decided to convert it into comic books or other forms such as board games, etc. He said that there were other people who had taken over control of that, and I had to speak with them, which I did, and almost got that going for a friend of mine who was a game designer, but he never went for it. It was his loss. He was just incredibly stupid. But the reason that I bring that up is to let people know that tangentially, I'm acquainted with Max Brooks. We're not friends. I'm just saying I met him, spoke to him. The reason why was because I was trying to ascertain how much he knew about the Sino-Soviet conflict. That was important because, of course, he starts his book with that. And all of that goes back into the history of Haiti itself, which I'll just briefly cover. Understand, of course, that Vajal Houduns, or voodoo in Haiti, one of its manifestations that people are most familiar with is the Haitian Zombie. This is spelled in the Haitian Creole. Their language is what's called a Creole. It's spelled Z-O-M-B-I. And that's very important. It's an important distinction. And the pronunciation, zombie. This is where, of course, they use various medicinals, herbals, apothecary ingredients, such as the spiny dermis, the TTX, the tetrodotoxin, that's removed from the crapaud de mer, the puffer fish, the toxic puffer fish. And they remove such elements and other known components of their formula, a gland from the boga toad, which contains potent psychoactive chemicals such as bufogenin, bufotoxin, bufotenine, various millipedes and tarantulas, which are biotoxic irritants, the skin of poisonous tree frogs, the seeds and leaves of any number of deadly plants. It varies a great deal regionally. And the ground up remains of human cadavers. Now that last element is the most insidious because that's where is introduced the potential for prionic, which is, of course, in case you didn't know, the term prion is an acronym for proteinaceous infectious ion. Ions are, of course, one of these elements that are not dead or alive. They are essentially in between. They cannot be killed. They cannot be burned, no matter how high the temperature, other than something the equivalent of a nuclear furnace, which decomposes them, or rather dismantles them at the atomic level. You can't sterilize prions. So with the introduction of that potential for prionic transmission, that can degenerate a zombie, Z-O-M-B-I, into a zombie, which is the E at the end. And that E at the end makes all the difference. It means that it's no longer a mindless automaton, a meat puppet, a mindless automaton that's under control of the voodoo bokar, or negative voodooista. It is now feral, like a shark seeking blood. This is a zombie gone wild. Now, all of this was only understood by the West in terms of degree. The first time the West investigated it was through an ethnobotanist, a specialist in ethnic botany and in anthropological herbs, named Wade Davis. And Wade Davis wrote his, he was then a doctoral candidate in ethnobotany at Harvard, and he was sponsored by a pharmaceutical company. Because Big Pharma, they're a financial market of about 300 billion United States dollars a year. They've got an incredible power in terms of their lobbying and their outreach. And when he was trying to bring back the zombie formula for Big Pharma, this was so it could be used, among other things, by NASA to put astronauts into a state where they would survive long journeys through the solar system. So with all of that power behind him, he brought back the zombie formula, which was called zombinol in the pharmaceutical term, and he produced a film called The Serpent and the Rainbow about his experiences with the Pau zombie, or what the Haitians would call the zombie powder. And he was hoping to make a difference with anesthetic shock, because 50,000 patients a year are still lost to anesthetic shock. But nothing was ever done with Zombinol other than in the black budget programs for astronauts. This is not the source of any concern, any immediate concern for the zombie phenomenon. Rather, when it comes to the zombie phenomenon as we understand it in the West, there's two places where you really began to see the phenomenon with completely different backgrounds and reasons for its manifestation happened during the Sino-Soviet conflict, and then take place in terms of the impact of the neutron bomb. When it came to what the Soviets were dealing with, they were dealing with the Haitian formula as was gifted to them via Cuba. And when they were gifted the zombie Florida by Cuba, they used it on dissidents in the gulags. And in terms of the Haitian formula, when you have the negative voodoo practitioners, the practitioners of the dark arts that create zombies, they're creating slaves with sluggish motor control, transmission of impulses in the neuromuscular action inhibited because the ion gates are blocked via the tetrodotoxin. And to maintain this kind of zombie-like state, these zombies are, they're fed regular ingestions of the plant Datura stramonium, the concombre zombie, the zombie's cucumber, or Jimson weed, which contains several narcotic alkaloids, including solanine. It's a botanical member of the nightshade family, which generates scopolamine. That's a tropine alkaloid drug whose effects have been described by rehabilitated zombie, and yes, zombie have been rehabilitated. It's described as an endless waking nightmare in which the subject is awake, but totally unconnected to the immediate world. So this is how the zombies are maintained by the voodoo practitioners, and this was how the dissidents were maintained by the Soviet Union in labor camps. They later on exploited that on the battlefield by using dissidents on the field of battle in the Sino-Soviet War. Now, to give people an example of how effective zombies can be in battle, one only needs to think of how the Haitians used them in their war for independence. The Haitians were always, originally slaves. They were slaves of the French Empire. And when they freed themselves from the French Empire, then they were forced to battle off all the European empires who tried to conquer them once they expelled the French. So when it came to their leader of Haiti, Toussaint Louverture, he fought first against Napoleon, and when Napoleon Bonaparte himself was expelled from Haiti, he fought against the British and against the Spanish. These were the most powerful European nations of the day, and he defeated all three of them. Much of this was because many of his men were willing to convert to zombie status so they would feel no pain or be able to take enormous amounts of damage and still take on the enemy. The Soviets applied this to their political dissidents, which they turned loose on the field during the Sino-Soviet conflict of the 1970s. So this is what Max Brooks was alluding to at the beginning of his book, World War Z. When it came to the American situation, this was what will ultimately bring us directly back to Israel. All of this phenomenon that was studied by the Americans in their attempt to create, well, the long sleep for astronauts, they only got a hold of the real concept as time progressed. They understood, thanks to Wade Davis, what was going on in Haiti, what the Soviets were dealing with. But of course, one of the things that was also not understood and just being discovered at the time was the concept of prions, or what made zombies feral, or what could ultimately be the cause of a zombie apocalypse. This was going on at the same time that a Jewish scientist who was an American citizen named Samuel Cohen was developing the neutron bomb. So in 1958, Samuel Cohen began to develop the neutron bomb because he was obsessed with preventing a new kind of conquest as had been conducted by Adolf Hitler's Third Reich, himself being Jewish. When Adolf Hitler conquered much of Europe, one of the things that the Germans did not have anywhere near comparable to what the Americans had was industrial capacity. Unlike the Russians or the Americans with enormous resources, Germany had a completely industrialized economy, but none of the resources to create an industrial powerhouse. In other words, the tools are there, the resources are not. So the way that Germany compensated was by cannibalizing everyone else's resources. When they conquered other nations, they would integrate the armor or the mechanized units of the other nations into their military. This became known as Adolf Hitler's Great Panzer Heist, meaning that the overwhelming majority of his mechanized columns were of foreign manufacture. They consisted of French, Czechoslovak, Hungarian, various other nations' tanks integrated into the German military system. So with that kind of capture and utilization of everyone else's own weapons against them, this is what made Dr. Samuel Cohen try to design a bomb that would kill all of the biological entities or troops in area, but leave all of their equipment intact for cannibalization by the conquering army. This is what the Soviets called the ultimate capitalist weapon, because it would protect real estate, so to speak. Now, when Dr. Samuel Cohen designed this neutron bomb, this was something that was not like an ordinary atomic bomb. A neutron bomb is essentially a dirty bomb. It's an ERW, an enhanced radiation weapon, a tactical fission, fusion, thermonuclear weapon designed specifically to release a large portion of its energy as energetic neutron radiation rather than explosive energy. In other words, it doesn't blow up so much as spew radioactivity. The burst of neutrons generated by its fusion reaction are intentionally allowed to escape. And so the ER weapon is what it is. As I said, enhanced radiation weapon. And most of the neutrons generated by its fusion reaction are allowed to escape its explosion rather than being consumed in the fireball, rather than being absorbed by its other components. Like standard nuclear weapons, they create increased explosive yield by capturing the neutron radiation. So they're like a miniature sun. But the neutron bomb's X-ray mirrors and its shell, they're made of chromium, nickel, so that the neutrons can escape. So there you have this kind of new revolutionary weapon. And Samuel Cohen presented it to John F. Kennedy. And John F. Kennedy was so appalled by it, he would not allow it to be tested above ground. At that time, John F. Kennedy was dealing with the Japanese. The Japanese had won the war. As you can find out about in The Roswell Deception and the Demystification of World War II, written by Douglas Dietrich, and yes, thank you so much, published by Skybooks USA. Thank you so much, that's our man, holding that up there for you. So, because the Japanese had won the war, there were many things that they had imposed upon the Americans. One of them was the ending of all above ground nuclear testing. Was a demand made by the Japanese because the above ground nuclear testing was polluting the Pacific. And so when it comes to the above ground nuclear testing and the pollution of the Pacific with radiation, the Americans, the Russians, and everyone who was part of the Allied United Nations was ordered to stop by the Japanese, and they all stopped. This should show people the level of power that Japan held at the time, and this was all based on the work of Japanese scientists proving that the radiation was polluting the Pacific Ocean. It's an important point to make. And because of this, Kennedy did not allow the neutron bomb to be tested above ground, even though technically it's not a nuclear weapon. So people understand this, not in the conventional sense. It's a dirty bomb, very different animal. So the year that my sister was born, and the year that Kennedy himself was assassinated, they tested it underground, which Samuel Cohen himself said was a waste of it, because that way no one could demonstrate its effects. The ground absorbed all of the neutrons. It did not demonstrate its capacity to kill life on the surface, whereas leaving all the equipment intact for reuse by the conquering enemy. That could only be done with an above ground test like they used to have with all of the experimental animals. By the way, for those of you who don't know, the above ground nuclear tests the Americans used to conduct, you can take a look at the footage where they have all the animals in cages to absorb the blast, to see the effects on animals. You can look that up yourself and you can understand what I'm talking about. Now, interestingly enough, it was in 1968 that George Romero produced, quite coincidentally, The Night of the Living Dead, which provided the modern concept of zombies in the popular cultural sense. And it was in 1969 that the Sino-Soviet War began. This was complete with nuclear exchanges that Americans interpreted as above-ground nuclear testing by the communist Chinese. And the entire production, the deployment of zombies in the field in the apothecarial sense, the pharmaceutical sense of zombie by the Soviet Union to exploit its dissidents. In 1971 is when the, shall we say, research into the prion really began. And so when it came to the prion and what it is, this was something that was originally explored by a Polish scientist who went to New Guinea. And what was going on in New Guinea was cannibalism of a ritual sense in which tribal members were eating their ancestors. And because the tribes in New Guinea felt it was an honor to absorb the essence of their ancestors by eating them, then what would happen would be the men would eat certain parts of the body and the woman would get other parts that were considered less important. So it turned out that what the women were eating in terms of the meat of their ancestors, the woman would usually eat the brains. And then they would, over time, many of the women were developing a horrible disorder where they would basically become very degenerate, as in Alzheimer's, senile dementia, what we would call Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease in cattle, CJ. When it came to this was due to prions, which were then researched in the West because the New Guinea people didn't have the resources to pursue this themselves. So the person who began to research this was a Polish scientist who had traveled to New Guinea. And when he traveled there and began to discover that it was due to cannibalism that these women were getting this disease, his name was Dr. Pavel Liberski. He worked with the Department of Molecular Pathology and Neuropathology at the Medical University of Lodz in Poland. And he was the first person to really begin to explore this phenomenon that in New Guinea, they call it Kuru, K-U-R-U, or the grinning disease, because you develop this death-like, skull-like grin when you're infected with this Creutzfeldt-Jakob prion disease. And so when it came to all of that, and he began to introduce this concept to the West, then that was when Dr. Stanley Preusner began to pursue the concept of prions and isolate them. And when he did that, that led him to a very shocking discovery that will ultimately impact us all. It's one of the reasons that many people are, shall we say it, obsessed with zombies because of all the predictive programming. Obviously, when you see zombies in film constantly, there's a reason for it. It's not simply because it's a popular obsession. It's predictive programming. That means the government's preparing you for something. It's because this is a very real fact that this is going to happen. By the way, as for the scientist, the Japanese scientist who isolated the radiation in the Pacific and told Kennedy to stop above ground nuclear testing, her name was Katsuko Saruhashi. You can look her up. First name is spelled K-A-T-S-U-K-O. Surname is spelled S-A-R-U-H-A-S-H-I. Katsuko is her first name, K-A-T-S-U-K-O. Last name is Saruhashi, S-A-R-U-H-A-S-H-I. She was dealing with conventional poisoning of Japanese fishermen by American nuclear tests in the Pacific. And she was brought to the United States, where she proved all of the Americans were wrong. They had no idea what they were dealing with. She proved that their radiation was polluting the Pacific and that if they continued to do this, they would destroy the Earth by poisoning the seas. And for that reason, Kennedy and everyone else agreed to stop above ground nuclear testing. And they thought that the communist Chinese were breaking the pact when the Sino-Soviet War began and nuclear exchanges were conducted with the Soviet Union in the desert regions of Siberia and northwestern China, what we call the Xinjiang region today. Now, it was in 1982 that Stanley Preusner articulated the prion, the concept of the prion, and wrote articles about it. And this was when they developed the concept of CJD, or Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease. 1972 was when Pavel Libursky first brought up the phenomenon, but it was Stanley Proisner who isolated the cause. So when it comes to these prions, the prionic particles that he isolated, one of the reasons it was so difficult for science to accept was because it was a threat that could not be dealt with. It was something that alarmed them because you can't kill prions because they're technically not alive. And yet they're not inanimate either. They're not inanimate objects. So, as I said, a lot of this came from cannibalism. And when you have a source of human cadavers that somehow get into the food supply, that is one way this kind of disease can manifest, or it can manifest from an external agent in a very different delivery mechanism, that of radiation. Now, throughout the mid-1980s, while Stanley Proisner was isolating the prion, and he ultimately won the Nobel Peace Prize for this, or the Nobel Prize in Medicine, I mean to say. Then what had happened was that while he was dealing with that, the United States went ahead after the death of Kennedy in testing the neutron bomb. So they began to manufacture neutron weaponry. And of course, since it was classified as an energy weapon, this was not above ground nuclear testing. And it was around 1978 that, well, 1963 was when Kennedy had it tested underground at the Nevada test facility. And the development was subsequently postponed by Jimmy Carter in 1978. But Ronald Reagan restarted the tests and production on April 7th, 1981. And this was, of course, before Proisner isolated the prion. It's, as a matter of fact, how he isolated it. Dr. Stanley Proisner ultimately won the Nobel Prize in Medicine because he finally had subjects to work with which isolated the prion. This happened when the Americans tested the neutron bomb. When the Americans first tested the neutron bomb above ground to prove Dr. Samuel Cohen's thesis that it would leave all the equipment intact and operable, they, of course, did what they did in the old days with their nuclear tests. Had animals in cages and had men on the front lines. And when they first blew that neutron bomb, you didn't have that spectacular mushroom cloud that's produced by conventional thermonuclear weapons. You had more of an above-ground burst that looked like a kind of shooting star effect. And this, of course, had to be blown above ground, as in above ground, not some ordnance left on the ground, because you're trying to saturate all of the ground in area, and that way you've got all of the exposed weapons saturated with radiation that kills all of the enemy, while allowing your troops to move in and occupy. But the troops that were closer to the bomb's blast, something happened to them. And all the troops that moved in to see what happened to the frontline troops, this is how they used to do it with the old thermonuclear blast, was they would expose the front line of troops to as much radiation as possible. Many of them would die of radiation sickness within weeks, months, years, sometimes days. And the other lines of troops would move in to recover them. This is exactly how they conducted these tests, was to sacrifice enormous numbers of troops. The United States did this regularly. This is the same mentality that the Soviet Union had whenever it played supermassive war games. And of course, they knew that their production of equipment was in the shit can. So they would produce chem suits, mop gear, we would call it in the United States, suits that would protect them from chemical exposure. The Soviets knew majority of what they produced had holes in the fabric, or the fabric seams were not lined or sewed correctly, so they would lose any number of troops. But the Soviets considered deployment of chemical weapons to be a standard part of modern warfare. They wouldn't go to war without deploying chemical weapons. They did that in Afghanistan quite frequently, even though the environment was not conducive to the use of chemical weapons. It didn't have the World War I effect where it stayed on the ground. The wind kept blowing it away, but the Soviets deployed it anyway, just in areas where it would have an immediate effect, and then the wind would clear it away, so the Soviet troops would move in. So they considered chemical warfare a standard part of modern warfare, and every time they played war games, they would deploy real chemical weapons. And because they knew any number of their troops would have faulty gear, they calculated on sacrificing several thousand troops. So anytime Soviet war games were held, thousands of men would die. That was just part of the process. This way they felt the survivors were better trained for combat. That was the mentality the Americans had with their above ground nuclear tests. And so they would sacrifice thousands of their own troops, feeling the other troops would be better trained for atomic warfare. So they had this process in mind, but this time the troops that moved in, the frontline troops attacked them and came at them ravenous, trying to devour them alive. This was the first contact that Americans had with the effect of what they would ultimately call an ERMI. That's an E-R-M-I-E. That's an acronym for an enhanced radioactivated molecular ionization event. So the enhanced radioactivated molecular ionization event, or an ERMI, what that proved was that the neutron bomb could automatically twist proteins in the body into prions, prionized, proteinaceous infectious ions. So this is something that would otherwise happen only through cannibalism. So it was at that time, with all of these ravenous zombie troops that were ultimately contained, Dr. Stanley Preussner finally had subjects with which he could isolate the prion. And of course, what he warned about was the fact that these were affected by TSEs. This is what they call it inside of cows. When the cows catch mad cow disease, then the cow's brains are analyzed, and when they take the carcass of the cow and they dissect the brains are thoroughly like Swiss cheese. They're full of holes. This is like a sponge effect. So it's called TSEs, or transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, meaning a pathology of the brain. A pathology of the brain which makes it spongiform, formed like a sponge, and it's transmissible, hence TSE, transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. And when you're dealing with this prionic spread, the reason it spreads to others when they bite, that's what's known as a PIMP, or a prionic isoformulatic microscopic particle. It transmits through the saliva. Human bites are horrible anyway, but this renders it much worse. The ultimate effect, what the ambulatory cannibalized zombies were called, was by an acronym of DAPH, D-A-P-H, or deceased ambulatory prionic host. In other words, the body is now simply a host for the prions that are motivating it. Hence, a deceased ambulatory prionic host. All of this is quite scientific and quite real, and it's a genuine phenomenon. So it's around that time, shortly thereafter, Dr. Stanley Preussner was able to identify what was going on in England. when in 1986, you began to have the first identified cases of mad cow disease in humans in England. So in 1986, you might ask, well, the British aren't cannibals. How did they get this? Was it above ground nuclear testing of their own? No, what happened was all skeletons that are on medical display in hospitals all over the world, by international agreement, come from India. You actually see this mentioned in the popular film Return of the Living Dead, which is, that part is quite factual. They bring up the fact that all of the skulls or skeletons in a dental school, in a medical school, the orders are always for perfect teeth. They want a perfect set of teeth in the skull. By the way, the guy brings up at the beginning of that film, is there anybody you personally know who's ever died with a full set of teeth in their mouth that's perfect? Of course not. Your average person is going to have all kinds of dental work by the time they die. They're going to have it by the time they're actually a teenager, likely. So when it comes to what the United Nations concluded, was that the only population in the world that could possibly demographically produce so many people that statistically they would have a person die with perfect teeth in their mouths because they're basically all not getting enough sweets to decay their teeth, was in India. China had an equally large population, but China didn't want to participate in this. They exploit their own people for cadaver preservation. There was a display of, you might remember, and people can look this up, it was a scandal. China had displays of the human anatomy, preserved human bodies that was going on tour all over the world. All of those were real human bodies, and all of them were political dissidents. So the Chinese would skin the political dissidents and preserve them in various states of having their tissues removed as medical displays that they sent all over the world. And this was on tour in public museums and everything else. You could personally go to see these things. And those were all political dissidents that they had skinned alive. That was a scandal. The Asian Indians, on the other hand, what happens is they've got over 1 billion people. Many of them are poor and quite expendable, and they die quite early. And therefore, by international agreement, all medical display skeletons come from India. As a matter of fact, to make sure that they have perfect teeth, the Indians will often kill them. That's why some of the skulls are found with a bullet hole in the back of the head. This is actually quite true. All of this I'm mentioning is part of this industry. And what do they do with all of the skeletons they don't use? Like certain dental schools only want a skull with perfect teeth. Certain hospitals don't need the full skeleton. They just need the skull. So oftentimes there are people whose bodies are rejected. They ground that into bone meal. And that bone meal is sold to the cattle industry in England because India was once part of the British Raj and is now part of the Commonwealth of Nations. And so they have trade agreements with England. So England was buying bone meal from India to feed its cows. That's where the cannibalism came in. So all these ground up human bones that wound up in the bone meal in India wound up in the cattle feeds in England. Hence, England began to manifest cases of New Guinea Kuru, or mad cow disease, as if they were a culture of cannibals. Now, when I was attending a lecture by Dr. Stanley Preusner at UCSF, and UCSF was bringing in all kinds of Nobel Prize winners for lecturing us in medical journalism at the Center for Extended Education's behest. These are the people who ran this program for medical journalism courses. And when I asked Dr. Stanley Preusner about prionic disease, what had happened in England, and what were the potentials for something like that in the United States, and he pointed out the fact that we have a gray wave. We've got more elderly people than we've ever had before. And when I asked him, like, how many of them will develop senile dementia, as in full-blown Alzheimer's, which is simply a human form of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease on cows. When you conduct an autopsy on the brain of a human who has died with full-blown Alzheimer's, they have the Swiss cheese effect and the melted cheese brain effect that the cows have. So they have the same kind of transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. And I said, how many people are going to suffer this? And he pointed out, you see, everyone in this auditorium, he said, out of all of you, statistically in this auditorium, he said, 1 to 2/3 of you will come down with this. And this is how bad it is. We face a future in which 1 to 2/3 of the population is going to simply organically develop this. Their prions will simply fold with age. And this is something, we've never had this many elderly people on the planet before, so we've never seen this effect. But this is what he predicts will be the ultimate effect of aging. But that's not necessarily a cannibalistic manifestation, as you got with the ERMI effect, that enhanced radioactivated folding of the prions. This is something that organically renders people useless and dependent. Well, in the 1980s, when Reagan began producing more and more of these neutron weapons, there were 4 types. Basically, there was the W-70 Mod 3 warhead that was developed for short-range tactical Lance missiles, the W-79 Mod 0, or Model 0, that was developed for artillery shells, the W-66 warhead for anti-ICBM, or anti-intercontinental ballistic missile. Well, that was developed for the Sprint missile system. It was produced and deployed in the mid-1970s and retired soon thereafter, along with the missile system. But you might ask, why an anti-ICBM warhead? What does that mean? That means that the dirty radiation it produces scrambles the electronic brains of incoming ICBMs. So in other words, if you've got an incoming ICBM, it has a primitive circuitry that serves as its guidance system, its brain. You can scramble that with a neutron bomb. The neutron bomb is a dirty radiation weapon that literally fucks up the circuitry of incoming missiles, so it serves as an anti-missile system. The end result, of course, the problem with all of this is the radiation that flies away, gets blown in the wind, gets scattered. When it came to the above-ground neutron bomb testing, it's not like all of that radiation, since it was blown in midair, sank to the ground. It got blown away in the wind. So what happened was much of that wind took the PIMPs, these prionic particles, the prionic isoformulated microscopic particles, they rode the wind. Many of them settled in American communities. These communities were mostly, due to the direction the wind was blowing in, the Americans had perfected this over decades. When they conducted above-ground nuclear testing, most of that conventional radiation blew and settled into these relatively underpopulated areas that were loaded with poor people that the Americans didn't care about. Downwind of the conventional nuclear testing, people can do research on this themselves. You can confirm everything I'm saying. The Americans wound up destroying entire communities with just conventional radiation, birth defects, people contracting cancer. With the neutron effect, when it settled in what were mostly isolated communities in the Appalachian Mountains or mining communities elsewhere in the United States, the same prionization took place where people were zombified in a much more active, hostile, desolate, well, dead but moving sands. This is why the Americans militarized their police forces. Just so people understand this, the people who deal with internal threats in the United States are the FBI. The FBI and other agencies like the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. When it came to these police forces being forced to respond to these kinds of crises, the United States government had to militarize them. And their response was to enter these areas and kill everyone in area because they were prionized. They were not only dead and ambulatory and hostile and aggressive, they were infectious. So they all had to be put down. This is why when those police forces are deployed, they respond with such exterminatory aggression. That's their training. This is why Waco went down the way it did. They respond to living people the way they were trained to respond to the Walking Dead. This explains why the police in America are so militarized, and when they respond with exterminatory force. That puts that into context. So when it came to the Air Force and its creation of weapons, I've given you 3 types of weapons. There was a fourth, and the fourth type was the W-69, a strategic variant redeployed for scorched earth. And by the way, no president ever had a high enough security clearance to assess the collateral damage of these neutron bombs. That's why they often gave the order ahead to build so many of them. Now, ultimately, the Americans, upon realizing that these weapons were more of a danger to themselves than the enemy, ordered the dismantling of all neutron warheads. So the last W-70 Mod 3 or Model 3 warhead was dismantled in 1996. The last W-79 or Model 0 was dismantled by 2003, which is like, what, only less than 20 years ago, something like 19 or so, and 18 or 17, really. And actually, all of the W-79 variants were dismantled around that time as well. And it was mostly America cleared itself of its inventory. France tested a neutron bomb in the Mururoa Atoll on June 24th, 1980. And they produced some weapons in the 1980s, but then they've since destroyed those weapons. But no country in the world today deploys neutron bombs except for Israel. See, Dr. Samuel Cohen, being Jewish, when the Americans began to finally develop his weapons and deploy them, ultimately, at least as a strategic reserve, and by 1997, Dr. Stanley Preusner had won his Nobel Prize. It was only the year before, 1996, that the United Kingdom actually gave an official proclamation of the VCJD, or the variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, that they admitted was sourcing from British beef. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, British beef is not allowed to be sold in the United States since that period of time that the British government came out and said that its cows were fed on human bone meal from India. And even though they put a stop to the practice, no one in Europe or America buys British beef. It's against the law to buy it in either Europe or the United States. So for people who don't know, they can research that themselves and verify that everything I say is true. So we're basically in a situation where what Dr. Stanley Preusner told me was that TSEs, or transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, will replace STDs, or sexually transmitted diseases, by the 2030s. And for that reason, he said, our future is The Walking Dead. And when it comes to Israel, the reason they maintain the neutron bomb is because they were, for the longest period of time, surrounded by hostile enemies, these hostile nation states, the Arab powers. And of course, those Arab powers could easily access nuclear weapons. Remember Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was producing nuclear weapons, and this is why the Israelis launched flights to destroy his facilities. The Iranians are trying to produce nuclear weapons now, and the Israelis know that at some point someone will launch missiles bearing nuclear warheads that could head towards Israel. Now, Israel is effectively, in theory, a one-bomb nation. You're talking about a nation that's smaller than New Jersey. And this nation, if a couple of strategic nukes hit it in the right places, pretty much everybody's dead. The population is wiped out. As a result, the Israelis maintain the neutron bombs, because if incoming nukes are launched towards them, they can launch the neutron missiles, which will scramble the brains, the electronic brains, the circuitry of the incoming warheads, and leave Israel intact. The collateral damage will be that everyone underneath the range of those neutron bombs will be zombified, prionized. The Israelis would be launching these missiles as anti-missiles in such a manner that they'd be impacting the incoming nukes before they reached Israel. So the people who would be prionized would be everyone around Israel. That's why the Israelis are building the walls. That's why World War Z was to show their population that their walls would hold. Now, hopefully that contextualizes the zombie apocalypse that everyone is expecting. The Israelis are fully expecting to zombify everyone around them. Of course, at the same time, they've created an alliance system that'll bring about the very war they fear. Because by allying with Saudi Arabia and Turkey in order to isolate Iran, they are, of necessity, creating a blood enemy out of the Kingdom of Jordan. And of course, they have Palestine and Lebanon directly near them, which will never be their allies. So the end result is Israel is on the wrong end of history and creating an alliance that will ultimately, potentially force it to deploy its arsenal of neutron bombs. So this is part of the tension that we're experiencing. Israel is becoming worse because of its tremendous influx of Russian immigrants, which aligns it ultimately with Russia. And the Russian immigrants are 1/3 of Israel's population, and it's agreed by all experts that it will provide its leadership in the future, its near future. Russia is a second language in Israel, the Russian language. And the end result is that you're going to have Israel aligned with the Sino-Slavic synaxis, along with Turkey and with the, House of Saud, along with Hungary is talking about leaving Europe and entering the Turkish Union. This is something that we're already seeing the ultimate lineup beginning to form towards the Third World War. And Israel is definitely on the side of the enemy. This is something that cannot be overemphasized. And they do have the neutron bombs. So the end result, hopefully, as I put some of this into perspective for people, a little bit of that dark satanic energy that is still, believe it or not, a little lighter than my going back into all of the child abuse that I had to witness at the Presidio. But nevertheless, hopefully informative to our listeners. Of course, I'll open myself to any questions from our man, Mr. Salman Sheikh here, or any direction he wants to take it at the moment. But I think
of course, Brother Douglas. I thank you so much for the great education that you provided us. And of course, this is what I cannot stress enough to the audience, that Brother Douglas Dietrich is our Vulcan interventionist against these agents of chaos and these cultists that exist in all races, religions, and countries and groups of the world. And this is the reason why you need to heed his words, his knowledge, support him in any way that you can. Which brings me to the question that I have is, for 2022 and beyond, let's say from 2022 through 25, how do you see this geopolitical alliance between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey impacting the world and not just the Muslim world, but the globe as a whole?
This is something that, of course, will lead us into a third world war. The kind of war that happened in World War I was this kind of coalition building, as was with World War II. Before every major war, you see this kind of realignment beginning, this kind of coalition building. What we have in Europe is the three white trash nations of Europe. I shouldn't say that, but these are nations that have descended into autocracy. They formed what's known as the Visegrad Troika. They call it the Visegrad Pact or Compact, but it's based on Czechoslovakia. Or, excuse me, there's no more Czechoslovakia. Slovakia is free and not part of this at all. Czechy, the rump state of the Czechy, aligned with Poland and with Hungary, or Magyarország. These three nations in Europe are completely autocratic. They represent nothing that Europe stands for. They're totalitarian dictatorships. And so as a result, they are far more like satellite states of Russia than they are part of the West. Meanwhile, Belarus and Ukraine, the people in both those nations really want to realign with the West completely. They hate being under the Russian yoke. So that balances out the defectors in the West with people who are trying to westernize in the East, white Russia and the Ukraine. So that's the European balance of power that we see. Of course, Europe itself, the core, is France and Germany. The biggest problem that they have right now, actually, aside from Russia, is England. Believe it or not, understand this much, Northern Ireland, of course, is part of the European Union, was part of the European Union until the British left. Now, Ireland's part of the European Union, and the people in Northern Ireland are trying to get into regular Ireland, European Ireland, as fast as they can, because they don't want to be trapped in the Brexit nightmare. So you will probably see an Irish reunification. The British don't want that, but even the German foreign minister told the British recently, he said this in his own words, he said, basically, wake up to reality. He said something that would have been considered completely undiplomatic. He said, you've got to wake up to reality about Ireland, that you can't keep Northern Ireland because the Northern Irish want to be part of Europe, as does Scotland. So Scotland and Northern Ireland are definitely going to go European Union, whereas Britain is going to be left in the cold. Its only real option is basically a kind of alignment with Russia. This is why you saw so many Russians in England.
Oh, yes. Everywhere, Brother Douglas, in London, and the subways, the construction workers, the entirety of London, everywhere I went, I was hearing Russian. I was walking around Westminster, the London Eye area. All I saw was Russians everywhere. I mean, if you go outside of London and you go to the different countryside areas and different cities, that's where a lot of you'll find the British, who have basically left London. There's the only ones that are there that are who can't leave, but majority is all I found to be all Russian.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. And aside from that, of course, the French are even blockading British ports. People may not be aware of this because the French and the British have a huge fishing dispute going on where they brought military ships into play. So Britain is literally in a kind of militarizing hostility with continental Europe. So when it comes to England, of course, you've got that problem with Gibraltar. And Gibraltar, you know, Spanish, the Iberian Peninsula, that's part of Europe. And of course, there's parts of Spain that are in Morocco, which means that the Moroccans have their own hostilities with Spain. So you see a kind of alliance that's going to build up between Britain and Morocco. But Britain will probably try and declare a kind of neutral stance in the upcoming war, or they will participate literally on the side of the Sino-Slavic Synaxis because of they have no real economic alternative, having divorced themselves from Europe. This is part of the problem that we're dealing with. So in terms of the situation, the geopolitical lineup as well, obviously India has aligned itself with Australia and Japan and the United States. But Pakistan is very much, as Salman Sheikh can say, very much a satellite state of Red China in many ways. It's just the way the politics, yeah. And
that's interesting, Brother Douglas, you point that out, because when I was in Islamabad in Pakistan, every nation is given its own embassy right in the diplomatic enclave area, but there's one country that's given exclusively two embassies, and that's the People's Republic of China, and they're just so close to each other that I saw many people from the Chinese background. I was in Islamabad, Karachi, Lahore. Everywhere I went, there were Chinese who were working there, living there, and doing business back and forth. So even as a Pakistani, it's easy for me to go there, but it just goes to show you the reality that we're dealing with.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so the geopolitics would be that Pakistan lines up on that synaxial side, and of course the end result is if real war were to go extreme, Pakistan and India both have nukes. So you have this situation in which they would almost wipe each other out immediately at the start of the war if it went nuclear. They're both, it's not even like nukes going into space. I mean, we're talking about like they border each other. They're just like lobbing them next door. This would be terrifying to contemplate, and hopefully it doesn't reach that point. But by the way, that Indo-Pakistani hostility was covered by Max Brooks in his book World War Z, and the way he presents it is in this ironic sense where instead of a Indo-Pakistani conflict, he brings up the fact that they suddenly are exposed to a conflict they never were prepared for, which is basically the prionization of the populations that are coming from the west of Pakistan. And that Pakistan suddenly finds itself having to try and reorient all its nukes towards attacking this incoming horde of zombies from Afghanistan. That's how he presents it in the book World War Z. That, by the way, was very clever of him. And also shall we say, there's other things, of course, in his book that were just based on ignorance, such as what he thought about Russia, and he portrayed them in this World War II fashion that was just locked in the past. It had nothing to do with present day reality. And for Germany, because of course he's Jewish and has very bad memories about it, he doesn't even touch it. It's just like Germany is like 1 or 2 pages, and other than that, it's almost like it doesn't exist in the book. So it's but in terms of where this war will go once things actually go active, proactive hostilities, then we'll see just how rapidly things develop. It's a war that, with modern weapons, we're looking forward towards the sustainment of conflict would be about a year. I would say you would take a year of active conflict for it to resolve before basically everybody's economies burn out. But definitely that's what I foresee happening if things go proactive in terms of hostilities, like in the immediate future. if we're lucky and we can postpone all of that for a decade or two, then things will be much better for us. At the same time, in terms of, by that, of course, I'm speaking of both Salman Sheikh and I are here in America. And as well, the other issue that we see happening is the potential for civil war here. So if we have civil war, then ideally we would have that first before a world war develops, because if we're able to settle that first, then deal with a world war, we'd be better off. Of course, it's just a nightmare all around. It's not something that it may sound sometimes like I'm excited about this. It's more like I'm trying to get people to understand the gravity of the situation, the urgency, the immediacy of it, and that we are in a situation where people need to prepare for this. At the same time, it's not something that I want. This is something that I'd rather things go smoothly and you know, our lifestyles are maintained, but unfortunately, the reality is not going to give us that. We're faced with a reality where we have a radicalized right in America that's extraordinarily dedicated to violence. They are, for all intents and purposes, on the side of the Sino-Slavic Sine-Axis. They're basically an insurgency. And when it comes to the situation, we should deal with them first and then deal with a global war. But if we have a America that is united after a civil war, then we could handle a world war. What people need to understand is that the thoughts of this ultimate nuclear extinction at the global level through thermonuclear conflict, that everybody launches their missiles and they all work. I mean, it's all bullshit. The majority of missiles are not going to work when it comes to intercontinental. They're just, the majority of them just aren't going to make it to the targets. Obviously, what few might conceivably make it to the targets, it's not because of any defensive systems that are stopping them either. It's just simply that the concept is so complicated and neither side has really maintained any technological edge. None of these sides really are working with a full deck, so to speak. Obviously, you only need to wipe out a few cities, and that really just is enough to threaten any economy. But the point is, America could absorb the loss of a few cities, and that's something that may very well happen, but it's something America can withstand. But the idea of a total destruction of everything due to thermonuclear war, it's just not realistic. So a world war is quite possible, and that is something America can handle if we get our act together, if we have the Civil War first. But, you know, this sounds incredibly insane just to casually speak of this in secession like that. But nevertheless, it's historically, it tends to be what happens. This is how it was after communist China had just been through a tremendous civil war in which hundreds of millions of people died. And when the nationalists retreated to Taiwan, the communist Chinese immediately went to war against the world. They were at war in the Korean Peninsula against the United Nations. So this is like the situation we would be in, would be like what they were in at that time. So hopefully that puts it into some perspective. That hopefully can give you some idea of the geopolitical lineup. But I really feel that when we get more and more of if the Democrats win the Civil War and we get a different kind of population in, we're not going to be loyal to Israel. That's the entire Republican ideology. The Republican ideology is identification with Israel as a white nation that the Americans consider a fellow white settler regime. And that, of course, the Republicans are the minority, and they can't maintain power forever. And the future of America is, of course, a diverse America, as opposed to what the Republicans are trying to maintain. So there we have that, and I'll be speaking. As a matter of fact, tomorrow night I'll be speaking of, I want to put this Kyle Rittenhouse thing to rest. And so I'll be speaking of that heavily tomorrow night, because there's still many aspects of it I haven't covered, and I really need to kind of complete before I can go back to geopolitics. But there we have that. And so, Salman, hopefully this was enough to provide us for this episode. I'll be happy by next month. I should be ready to go back into more darker areas again. And, you know,
I love you dearly, my brother. And next month, at the end of the month, same time, for part 6, I wanted to maybe go into the Chochoa or anything like that of the sort, where we can plan on a later date in terms of the subject. But that's something that came in my mind in terms of the future for part 6. And of course, all the videos that you have done with me, the transmissions, you have full rights to all of them. And with this video, I will make sure I send it to John Warrington as well. And
bless you.
All the viewers, please support our brother Douglas with vampirology and with the Roswell deception and the demystification of World War II. Please get it from Amazon, Skybooks USA. I'll put the links in the description below. Donate to him. Listen to his show every Wednesdays and Sundays, and I'll be on with him tomorrow. I'll post the links for that, for his PayPal. Give him a 5-star review on Amazon. Report the gang stalkers. And I pray that Allah, the Creator, continues to bless my brother Douglas with happiness, protection, and success from the enemy. And that I stand with you always till the end. My love and prayers are always with you. And thank you again. And for the audience, Brother Douglas will join us at the end of next month as we head towards the new year for part 6. And thank you all. Much love to everyone. Thank you.
And God bless you in turn. I love you dearly, my brother. A kind of afterthought, if you don't mind, like we did with the last program, certain things. I'm sure some people have questions about the image used for tonight's program. Understand that when it comes to many of the wealthy in the United States, my son married someone who is wealthy enough to maintain him, and I'm very fortunate that he did that. And when it comes to the hobbies of these people, many of them collect exotic pets. So people understand that many animals all over the world due to climate change are going extinct, and there's a negative to animals being taken for pet trade. And obviously it's to be discouraged in one sense. In another sense, it's really the only thing that preserves these animals, as they're born and bred in captivity and maintained in private collections. So it serves as also its own kind of reserve. It's an interesting paradox. But in California, both through my connections with the underworld and my connections with people who have money to purchase from that underworld exotic pets, good example of this was in the Balkan Wars, when I was in that area of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the regions surrounding Serbia. There was somebody who had these exotic animals from the Croatian caves. These cave dragons, they called them. These were like salamanders, very similar to the Mexican axolotl. In other words, like albino kind of, or pale. There's no pigmentation on these aquatic animals. This was something that was going to die anyway, was being sold in a market, and I purchased them and sent them home. And it turns out that these animals have this ability that if you look up these cave-dwelling kinds of salamanders in Croatia, where they don't need to eat for half a decade or even a decade, they can go for 10 to 20 years without eating. And they maintain themselves in this kind of aquarium, an open aquarium. We kept them in at home until my parents died. One died with each of my parents. When my father died in my sister's birth month in 2007, one of them died, and then the other died when my mother died in my sister's birth month of March in 2011. 5 years apart. They both died at the same age, 87 years of age, both of my parents, and 5 years apart in the same month. and at the same age. And each time one of those creatures died, that's one example of this exotic bond between animals and humans. The other was, oh, by the way, we're still recording, right?
Oh yes. What Skype does is after you go past 3 hours and 3 minutes, it splits into another video file. So I'll just have to combine the both video files.
Oh, I see. And the other point I was trying to make about the centipede. So what's on the photograph there? That's in this case, a Madagascaran or Malagasian centipede. These are extremely venomous, of course. They're not to be handled by anyone other than experts or in the company of an expert. But the reason it was, shall we say, relevant to tonight's transmission is because this is actually what you maintain to really identify the prionized zombies. This is what was isolated by Dr. Stanley Preusner himself in terms of it's a carrion eater, and because they're carrion feeders, they sense the dissident ambulatory prionic hosts almost like a guidance system. So they're very important to have around in terms of alerting you to what's in the environment. In that sense, they're almost a totemic animal. It's something for people to understand why I was posing with one for tonight's image on the promotional banner. With that, of course, I'll end transmission with our dear brother, Salman Sheikh. God bless
Brother
you.
Douglas, before you leave, there's one thing I would like to say is that a few days ago when I was sitting at the park where I do my pull-ups and feed the birds, I sat down under the trees and I prayed for you and I prayed for the soul of your mother, that Allah rest her soul in peace. And that thought came in my mind when the Prophet Muhammad said that heaven lies at the feet of your mother. My brother, you have served your mother well. You continue to serve her soul and her purpose. There's no force on this world that can do anything to you. You continue doing what you're doing with full confidence that you are protected by forces beyond this world that are guiding you and always protecting you and making sure you fulfilled the purpose that you were sent here to this world for. So if you served your mother, like what Islam teaches from the teachings of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that heaven lies at the feet of your mother. So heaven is always around you no matter what these agents of chaos and these cultists and these gang stalkers do. They will be destroyed by Allah on the day of judgment with the punishment of the hellfire. And my love and prayers are with you always. And please, everyone, support Brother Douglas Dietrich every Wednesdays and Sundays on his transmissions. Go to all of his videos and please put a thumbs up on all of his videos to counteract against the agents of chaos. And I will put his PayPal and his links for his books. And next month, part 6, I look forward to discussing with him as we head towards 2022. Much love to everyone, and assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. I love you dearly, brother. Thank you, Brother Salman. God bless you. All right, we'll speak again soon. You take care.